welcome to the course today. Today's course, as titled, is an introduction to the developmental disability system in the state of Ohio. In Ohio, we're very fortunate in that we have a very large and very robust DD system. I say DD, it's the first of many acronyms you're going to hear today, just standing for developmentally disabled. I'm very thankful that we have a large and robust DD system in Ohio, but it's admittedly can be very confusing and overwhelming at times. And I'm sure some of you have encountered that sometimes it can be confusing and overwhelming. And it often makes me think of something that was told to me back when I started law school, that with law you have to know everything to know anything, that it's circular in that way. And in a lot of ways, our DD system mirrors that, in that it's hard to understand any one part of the DD system without understanding the system as a whole. And so while today's course is not going to be able to cover the whole gambit of services, what we want to do today is bring to your attention just some of the basics. We'll start with what is a team? What does a team consist of? What are some of the services that are available to individuals? We'll spend a lot of time on MUI and UIs, which is unusual incidents, and how we report those in the system. We'll talk about the rights of individuals and spend a long time talking about rights of individuals, because that's been an area of great change, and it's been an area where across the state there have been a lot of questions and at times concerns and confusion about how that works in today's environment. And then we'll also finish with talking about disputes, how disputes arise amongst the team, how to resolve disputes, and then we'll spend a little bit of time talking about guardian liability as well, because guardian liability always follows along with anytime you talk about rights and increasing the rights of individuals under guardianship. But before we get started on all that, one of the things we always like to know is just get a little bit better idea as to who's in the audience. So a lot of you at remote sites, I encourage you to do this where you are, because I think it's helpful to get an idea of who you're sitting next to and who's in the room. So by show of hands, how many individuals in the room are a guardian? Okay. You'd be surprised how many people take the course that aren't actually a guardian. And you, like me, may scratch your head as to why they would take the course if they're not a guardian. But we welcome them as well. How many individuals in the room are the guardian of a family member? Okay. So again, that holds pretty consistent with the courses we've taught, in that the majority of guardians are guardians of family members. How many are guardians that are volunteers? Maybe you're whether you're a professional or an attorney, but you're guardian of someone in a volunteer capacity. Okay, so not as many, but some. So again, today's course, it is an introduction. It is a basic snapshot of our developmental disability system. And with that, we'll turn it over to Beth, who will get us started with some of the acronyms and eligibility.
I can get out of my seat and around the table without tripping and falling is always good. Good afternoon, everyone. So, as Derek talked about, we have some goals and learning objectives. You all have a packet with our PowerPoint, verbatim. Everything you see up here is everything in there, so feel free to follow along. Just some goals and learning objectives for us this afternoon. Describe the core elements of the system in place to support adults with developmental disabilities. We're going to identify the rights of individuals with developmental disabilities, identify the criteria used to determine eligibility for County Board developmental disability programs, discuss the roles and responsibilities of our team, and recognize available services, and also recognize some key approaches to resolve disputes. So if anybody didn't have any objections for that being our goal today, we'll move forward. As we always talk about, any system you enter, that's like they have their own language, right? And so we use funny acronyms. We talk like a whole new language. So what we thought we would do is start out the course with some terms and acronyms that you'll hear myself, Heidi, and Derek use throughout the course. So this first slide, I won't read them to you. You have them for your reference. But just to highlight a few that you will hear consistently and a lot during the course is DD, which is developmental disability, DODD, which is the Department of Developmental Disabilities, ICF, IDD, or IID, Intermediate Care Facility for Intellectual Disability. The ISP, we're going to talk a lot about the ISP, and that stands for Individualized Service Plan, and the SSA, which is the Service and Support Administrator. The one on this slide that probably we'll use the most is the QIDP, which is a Qualified Intellectual Disability Professional, and then you'll see some of the other ones throughout the course as well. Okay, so let's talk about services. And so when we're talking about services that are available to the people that we support, maybe someone that you're an advocate for, a guardian, and receive services primarily through the county board. So in order to receive services, of course, in every system, there's an eligibility determination process that has to happen with some criteria. So in our system, in order to be eligible for services, it's determined by the county board. You have to have specific qualifications to be eligible, and you have to have these 3 qualifications to kind of for point A of eligibility. There's multiple points to it. You have to have a mental or physical impairment. It had to have manifested before the age of 22, and it has to have the likely to continue indefinitely. So if a person meets the criteria and is determined eligible for that part of the eligibility process, then someone from the intake department, however county boards have it structured, will come out and do an assessment that talks about kind of the person's skills, what they can do on the day-to-day. They may choose to use the OEDI if it's an adult, a COEDI if it's a child, or LOC, which stands for level of care, as their determination tool for county board services. But everybody who receives like a waiver services or funding has to meet a specific level of care, which is another kind of layer to it if the level of care is not used as their primary eligibility assessment tool. So once found eligible, there are kind of a list of services that could potentially be available to a person receiving county board services. Not every service listed here is available for everyone. It depends on kind of demographics of where you live, what are available within your own county board, and in your own county in general. But the one service that everybody is absolutely eligible for is the Service and Support Administrator services provided by the county board. So everybody gets an SSA if they request one. So the next slide, we're just talking about how are services funded? Who pays for it? Do I have to have a waiver to get services? Do I have to have specific things in order to have anything paid for, any service or support for the person? And the answer is there are multiple ways in which people receive services. There are local funds, or what we refer to as levy dollars, where almost every county board in the state of Ohio operates some sort of local levy where it's passed by our local taxpayers. Medicaid waiver services, the waiver is also a funding stream. It's probably the most familiar and talked about. So that is a funding service, or a funding stream, I should say. Traditional Medicaid services, and what we're talking about here is actually Medicaid, the kind of the insurance, traditionally known as kind of the insurance policy of Medicaid, where specific services could be paid for through there. And then private pay. Folks do have the option if they wanted to go to a day service and these options weren't available to them, they could privately pay based on their income and eligibility for that. So Derek's going to talk to us, what is Medicaid?
So Beth just very briefly hit the highlight and scratched the surface of some of the services that are available through the county board system, and that's important. And we'll go over some of those services in a little bit more detail later on. But one of the first questions one of the questions I get a lot is, how do I get these services? And what determines what services I'm eligible for? And really, when I get that question about, what services can I get for the person I'm serving, what services can I get for the person I'm guardian for, it really comes down to 2 primary questions, and that is, what is our funding stream? How are we paying for these services? And what county are you in? Because unfortunately, the county you're in does make a difference. All counties, in my experience, do a good job of trying to provide all of the services they can, but the reality is that in some of the more rural service or counties versus some of the more urban counties, the services aren't going to be the same across the board. In counties where levies haven't passed, it might not be the same services that are available in counties where levies have passed. That's why your county boards spend so much time lobbying and campaigning to pass levies so that they can provide some of the services that Beth mentioned. But when we talk about funding, services are always going to be available if you're willing to privately pay for them. But we also know that a lot of individuals with developmentally disabled don't have the means to privately pay for them. And so that puts us into the world of government benefits. And oftentimes we hear about Medicaid, and we hear that Medicaid will pay for this and Medicaid will pay for that. And so the first question we get from a lot of family member guardians is, what the heck is Medicaid? What are we talking about when we say Medicaid? Because it's very confusing when we think about Medicaid versus Medicare, and then it gets even extra confusing when you throw in terms like SSI and SSDI. But just looking at Medicaid, because a lot of the services that you might be receiving through a county board are in one way or another going to be funded by Medicaid. So just looking at Medicaid. Medicaid is an entitlement program that began back in the 1960s, and then it really got revamped in 1971. What it was originally designed to do was to pay for the long-term care in a facility of individuals who needed to be in a facility. So whether it's an elderly individual that needed to be in a nursing home, or it was an individual with a developmental disability who unfortunately back then more often than not resided in an institution, Medicaid was there to pay for the cost of either that institution or a long-term care facility or nursing home for someone. So that was originally what Medicaid was designed to do. Now that's changed over the years, and we've created what's called the waiver system. And we'll talk more about that in just a second, where we pay for home and community-based services. But we still have traditional Medicaid. And by still having traditional Medicaid, this is the Medicaid that still today, just like it did back in the 70s, it pays if you live or reside in a long-term care facility. So for an elderly individual, whether they have a developmental disability or not, if they're residing in a nursing home and they meet the financial criteria, because keep in mind, as Medicaid, it is an entitlement program, so there are some pretty strict financial requirements in order to be eligible for Medicaid. We're not going to get into those today because that would eat up our 3 hours in a heartbeat if we tried to get into all of those requirements. But if you meet the financial requirements, Medicaid will pay for the long-term care facility. Likewise, for your loved ones with a developmental disability, if they have a level of care, whether it's driven by needs with nursing or otherwise, and they need to reside in a care facility, in Ohio we have ICFs, intermediate care facilities. And so individuals through traditional Medicaid can still reside in an ICF, and Medicaid will pay for the cost associated with that ICF, the intermediate care facility. Now, intermediate care facilities, in a lot of ways, they look and feel like maybe a nursing home when you walk into them. In the DD system, a lot of people get mad and kind of hawk up their shoulders and say, no, it's different, because there are some nuances, there are some differences between an ICF and a nursing home, but you do kind of have to scratch a little bit deeper to see those differences sometimes, because a lot of times it has that feel to it. But unfortunately, some individuals do have that level of care where they need nursing, they truly need nursing attention and medical attention at all times, and usually that's what drives the need for someone to reside in an intermediate care facility. We also still have traditional Medicaid services in the form of it's paying for certain medical expenses and things of that nature. Now, Medicaid's been further confused in recent years when we throw into the mix things like Obamacare and things of that nature, which adds a different level of Medicaid availability and a broader range of availability of Medicaid services to individuals. Looking just at today, though, the individuals that are age blind or disabled, and today we're here to talk about individuals with developmental disabilities, they still receive Medicaid through traditional Medicaid. And so, as I said a second ago, it's originally designed to pay for services for those individuals that need to reside in a facility. Well, what the government quickly realized is it might be less expensive if we, instead of paying for someone to live in a facility, if we provided HCBS, home community-based services to this individual, and instead of paying for them to live in a facility, we could pay less and help them live where they are, independent of a facility. And so that's how we came to having the waiver system. And all states now have waivers in one form or another. Some states call them something different, but all states now have waivers available. So when we say a waiver, what we are waiving is the federal government is saying you can have Medicaid dollars, and we are waiving the requirement that the individual reside in a long-term care facility, because that's what Medicaid dollars were originally restricted for, payment of long-term care facilities or institutions. So we're saying you can take money out of this pot of federal dollars, we'll give it to the states, and then you can use those to pay for some of the services that Beth just highlighted. In Ohio, we have a number of different types of waivers. The waivers most common to individuals with developmental disabilities, those are the ones we're going to look at. Those are the Level 1 waiver, the self waiver, the IO waiver. IO stands for individual options. And then there's the TDD, the transitions waiver. If you have a transitions waiver, we're not going to spend time on it today because the transitions waiver goes away next year. Individuals that currently have a transition waiver are going to be transitioned into an IO waiver beginning next year. So we're not going to spend a lot of time. But Ohio also has other non-developmental disability waivers as well. So when you hear about waivers called passport and home care and some of those waivers, those are not DD-specific waivers. The waivers we're going to look at, Level 1, Self, and IO, these are DD-specific waivers. So, Level 1 waiver. First of all, to have a Level 1 waiver, just like I said before, you've got to meet the eligibility requirements. And the eligibility requirements for a waiver is you have to be eligible for Medicaid. So, if you're receiving services from the County Board of Developmental Disabilities, and you're eligible for Medicaid, you can apply for a waiver. One of the things, again, I said that we have a big DD system in Ohio, and it is confusing. I often tell people, I have a daughter with Down syndrome, and when she was born, I did not know anything about Ohio's DD system. Didn't know anything about developmental disability system, knew nothing about it. I can tell you within literally a day of her being born, we were still in the hospital, we had lots going on, as I'm sure some of you can appreciate, and we had already been visited by a social worker, and I was already reading literature about needing to be on the wait list for waivers and Level 1 waivers and things of that nature. I mean, they hit you with it right away. And it was ready to make my head pop because I didn't understand it whatsoever. Now that I've been in the system and work in the system, I really appreciate it, but at the time it really made my head spin. And so with waivers, the first waiver you're typically going to be offered in the DD system, and I say typically because there's always exceptions, the first waiver you will typically be offered is a Level 1 waiver. A Level 1 waiver, we have in the state of Ohio about 15,000 individuals on Level 1 waivers. A Level 1 waiver will pay, it has a maximum payment of $5,000, so that's for an annual basis. So for every year, you can have about $5,000 paid for some of the services Beth highlighted. Now, Beth went through that list of services pretty quickly. In your materials, at the end, we have the Ohio's handbook for the Level 1 waiver. If the person that you are the guardian for is receiving a Level 1 waiver, you need to stop and read that handbook. It's well written and it goes into a good bit of detail in terms of what services you're entitled to under a Level 1 waiver. There are exceptions. One of the things a lot of people, they get on a Level 1 waiver and they'll use that to pay for day program or day rehabilitation programs. And as Beth pointed out this morning, that's a different income stream. So you have the $5,000 limit, but it can pay for day rehabilitation programs over and above that, or separate and apart from that. And so there's lots of little nuances about the Level 1 waiver that you need to be aware of. The Level 1 waiver is oftentimes the first one you will receive, and unfortunately we don't get it when we actually want it most of the time. My daughter is 7 and she's still on a wait list, and who knows if or when she'll ever need or receive a waiver, but the wait list can be several years sometimes to get a waiver. It's not uncommon to wait a long time to get a waiver. So looking at the Level 1 waiver, if you're receiving a Level 1 waiver, you need to look at, am I maximizing it? Am I getting as much as I can out of that waiver? Am I getting respite care that I might need? Am I getting environmental adaptations that I might need? Do I have the person in the right day programming? Because that opens the door for funding for these things. If an emergency exists and the $5,000 will not cut it, under a Level 1 waiver, you can apply for emergency funding. And so you can receive an extra $3,000 of emergency funds under the Level 1 waiver. The next waiver is the SELF waiver. SELF stands for Self-Empowered Life Funding Waiver. It is Ohio's first participant-directed waiver. The SELF waiver in Ohio is greatly underutilized at this time. Of all of Ohio's waivers, the SELF is the most infrequently used of all waivers. It's only about 5 or 6 years old, and the SELF waiver it has a maximum annual spending range of $40,000. And I say that's the maximum annual spending range, but within the waiver, there's different limitations that apply. There are certain services that you can only spend so much a year on, and there's different little nuances and rules. In a lot of ways, it is a very good waiver for certain individuals. So again, in your materials, there's the self-handbook. And so if you are offered or receiving a self-waiver, I encourage you to read that handbook so you can make sure you're getting the most out of that waiver. Now, keep in mind, across the entire state of Ohio, as of October of 2016, there had only been 892 self-waivers issued. And the general rule of thumb, and most attorneys will know this, but the general rule of thumb is you would never turn down a waiver. And if ever you do turn down a waiver, it seems like self is the only one I've ever seen people frequently turn down. And it's not because there's something wrong with it. A lot of times I think it's because it's either misunderstood or the person's holding out and thinking that if they take the self, it'll reduce the likelihood that they can get the next waiver we're going to talk about, which is an IO waiver. But if you're offered a self-waiver, I would stop. I would look at what's going on in the person's life that you're serving, which of these services can they benefit from, and is it in their best interest to accept a self-waiver. The next waiver we're going to talk about is the the individual options waiver, IO waiver. In the state of Ohio, whether you're looking at DD waivers or all waivers, in my opinion, this is the best waiver you can have, and it is a DD-specific waiver. The individual options handbook, like the others we've referenced, are in your materials in the back. When you hear about waiting lists and you hear the stories about people wanting waivers and not being able to get waivers, this is the waiver they're most often talking about, an IO waiver. An IO waiver opens the door to a number of different services. It can help with the costs associated with everything from employment to transportation to meal delivery to day programming to community outings and everything in between. Unlike most waivers, it doesn't have a hard cap ceiling, but rather instead of saying this is the most you can spend, what happens is every year on an annual basis, your county board, SSA, or whoever your contact is, different counties use different names, but it's an SSA, they will meet with you and they will do an assessment. They'll try to identify what's going on in this person's life, what are the needs. Based on that assessment, the Disability Determination Profile, or DDP, based on that DDP, they will assign a funding range. And Ohio has 9 different funding ranges. And then within that funding range, you can spend and allocate for the services that are necessary. Beth will talk in a second about the plan, the ISP, and so you get your funding range based on what the needs are laid out in the plan and what the services are, etc. The IO waiver, we did this course this morning and someone said they had turned down an IO waiver and it made us all cringe because an IO waiver is something that you would never turn down. Everyone who is the guardian for someone with a developmental disability, one, should be on a wait list for waivers, and secondly, should accept an IO waiver if ever offered, because it is the premium of waivers in Ohio, and it does open the most doors and possibilities for individuals. We included the Ohio home care waiver. We just briefly want to mention this because in Ohio, there are several individuals with developmental disabilities who receive the Ohio home care waiver. The Ohio home care waiver is not a DD-specific waiver. It is not designed for DD individuals with developmental disabilities, but nevertheless, it's the one non-DD waiver where several individuals do still receive the Ohio home care waiver. That's not a bad thing. We just say that to highlight that there are some differences in that instead of being administered through your county board, it's administered through your county Department of Jobs and Family Services. So there's a slightly separate set of rules that apply with the Ohio home care waiver for those that may be receiving that. So, all right, with that, Heidi will come up and talk about more about waivers and wait lists.
Thank you. So Derek went over all the types of waivers. We've talked about ICFs a little bit, which are not waivers. But the thing about waivers is there aren't as many waivers as there are people that want them, right? So there are 88 counties. All 88 counties have waiver waiting list. So no matter what county you go to, there's going to be a waiting list. Can you be on a waiting list in more than one county? Absolutely, you can. Does your waiting list date crossover? Yes, it does. What that means is, let's say you had a child and you heard about waivers maybe, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, and you put your child on the waiting list for a waiver, because like Derek mentioned, a lot of people think it's a good idea because it may be way down the road before you really need it, and you can kind of decide at that time. But the earlier your date, the further up the waiting list you go. So let's say you were on a waiting list for an IO waiver, individual options, 15 years ago. Maybe you don't really need it, you were trying to plan for the future, and now things are kind of changing. Maybe your child is now an adult, wants to do some things with somebody else other than you, and you think, well, what about this level 1 waiver? Maybe this would work for us. Your date, your waiting list date from 15 years ago, that kind of placed you in there, can transfer over to your level 1 waiver, which wasn't even in existence at the time, maybe, right? So your waiting list date transfers over across waivers. If you add from one county to the next, it crosses over. And that's just how it works. So once you're there, okay? So then you're waiting for a waiver. Now, while you wait for a waiver, there are other things that can happen, other ways people can receive services. And your county board, remember, anybody who's eligible has an SSA, Service and Support Administrator, at the county board. Your county board Service and Support Administrator can kind of talk to you and explain to you what other options might be available in your county. It might be local funding for some particular things that they can talk to you about. They can talk to you about what services are available through traditional Medicaid, through your state plan card, where maybe you can get 14 hours a week of some type of aid, or a variety of other things, some other resources. They can also talk to you about intermediate care facilities, ICFs, which is what we commonly call them, which would be an alternative residential service. It's residential and some kind of covers everything that the person might need. So when we talk about residential services, that's something that is commonly utilized by people in our system. So people in the DD system can receive supports, whether they live in their family home. Providers can come into your home to provide services to your loved one. Even if they're in their own apartment or a condo, or their own house, again, whether they live by themselves or maybe if they live with a couple friends, a couple peers, they can receive residential services. Somebody can come into the home and provide what we call homemaker personal care in their home. Shared living is a new kind of hot service within our system. It's not really new. We've had adult foster care for a while, but you won't hear people use that term so much anymore. What you will hear is shared living. And what that looks like is any family, no matter what the family looks like, right? The family could be me, single person. I could decide that I want to share my home with an individual with disabilities. We live together in my home. We function as a family. Even though I'm a paid provider, my home, their home, we live together and we function as a family. It could be any other family. It could be a mom and dad that have 6 kids and say, hey, we can fit one more person. Maybe somebody that likes kids a lot, maybe never had a family and is interested in that. So shared living is really a hot topic right now, and it's about developing relationships. So being more than just a paid provider, coming in, staff turnover, somebody different all the time. It's about that family and that person coming together and things working that way. Licensed waiver facility, another residential option under our waivers, right? A licensed waiver facility is kind of a 2-part thing. The actual house, the facility is licensed. So there are some requirements about sizes, who can share rooms, what kind of things have to be available, all those kind of things about the building, the structure itself. But then the provider who operates that licensed waiver facility is also certified. So they're certified to provide the services, and the certification kind of says, hey, you got to do this for your staff, that for your staff, you got to work with the county board, all those kind of things. So it's almost like double oversight. There's some physical site requirements, and then there's other general requirements that all providers have to have in our system. Usually in licensed waiver facilities, the provider is also the owner of the home. So sometimes potentially that could be a conflict, you know, maybe I love my house, but I'm upset with my provider, I want to pick a new provider. Well, that would probably mean I'd have to leave my house, right? So you might want to consider that when you think about licensed waiver facility. But sometimes it's kind of that bridge between ICFs, which we'll talk about, and waiver services in the community. The last one, residential services, intermediate care facilities, ICFs. So ICFs, we have numerous ICFs across the state. They range in size anywhere from a 4-bed up to, the largest that I'm aware of was 139, but we have a lot of downsizing efforts. So very large facilities. Some are a small 4-bed home, some are great big campuses, right, with multiple buildings on the campus. We have 10 developmental centers that are state operated. We are currently downsizing, just like all ICF operations in the state. And by July of next year, we will have 8 developmental centers. 2 of them are scheduled to close. We're taking the initiative just like other providers. The federal government is very interested in services being provided in the community, right? Hence the growth of HCBS waivers. Lots of home and community-based waivers, less institutions, okay? Facilities are institutions. Like I said, they're all different. 4-bed up to 139. Some might look and feel a lot like a licensed waiver facility, some of the smaller ones. Some of the larger ones are even split. I have been to some nursing facilities where one half of the facility is a nursing home and the other half is an ICF, and they kind of function in the same manner. And you've got everything else in between. But ICFs are different from waivers because they are responsible for all services to the person. Like they truly wrap their arms around the person, should know all of the individual's needs. They provide the residential services at the facility. They generally contract with physicians, dentists, therapists of all sorts, and they're provided at the facility. Sometimes they have their own day program. Sometimes they contract with an outside entity and folks go to different places. It's really up to them to determine how they want to do that. So it's really all across the board. But in the end, they're responsible for the person's entire day and all services. So you heard me mention a couple of our developmental centers are closing. There are a lot of downsizing efforts with ICFs. We're definitely going towards a trend of more home and community-based services. And as we do that, some things are happening for folks who live in ICFs or are considering moving into them. Historically, you know, we talked about waiting lists and sometimes you can be on them for a long time. Historically, if you lived in an ICF, you could be placed on a waiting list for a waiver, but chances are you were never going to get one. Never ever, wasn't going to happen, because there are kind of priorities with waiting lists, and people who are in need of services kind of rise to the top for their variety of priority reasons, emergency situations, those kind of things. Somebody who lives in an ICF, all their needs are met already. So they're always going to be at the bottom of that list, and people with a greater need, we're always going to be above them. But now we're kind of in a different place in our society, and as things change and we start to move away from institutional care and that type of placement, there are 2 things happening. Let's talk about options counseling first. Options counseling is for anybody who currently lives in an ICF. Are any of you the guardian for somebody who lives in an ICF present at the current time? Okay, a couple of people. So options counseling is for folks who live in ICFs who are thinking, maybe I want to move out into the community. So options counseling is happening right now. There are discussions being had so that people who live in ICFs can know, hey, here's what else is available, you know? So people are sharing the different waiver options and what might be available to that person so that they can make an informed decision of, yeah, maybe I don't want to live in an institutional setting anymore. Maybe I do want to live move into my community. And so that they know what is available and they can make a decision whether or not they want to go forward for there. People who decide that they do not want to live in the ICF anymore, there's a special little group of waivers just for those folks, no waiting list, so that they can move out into the community. And then pre-admissions counseling is very similar. So this is made available to folks who are considering moving into an ICF. Maybe you're not in an ICF right now, but you know, you're far down on a waiver waiting list and some things have changed at home and there's a need for care. So you're considering moving into an ICF. Then you will have pre-admissions counseling where the county boards will discuss with you, hey, here's the other options. See what you think, what might better meet your needs, right? And then there's a special pot of waivers for those folks if they would choose that instead of the ICF setting. So this, you know, this is the first time in many, many years that folks who lived in ICFs have ever had choice, or folks who were considering moving into them. Historically, they didn't have any choice. You could move from one ICF to another if one had an open bed and they were accepting, you know, but other than that, you kind of couldn't move where you wanted to. And now, if you want to, there's a whole lot of options available. And it's a very exciting time in our service delivery system. So Beth is going to talk about individual service plans with you.
Thanks, Heidi. All right. So the individual service plan, so we've been through how we're determined eligible, what services might be available. So now we're kind of at the point where we're deciding. We're coming together and kind of determining what services and supports are going to be available and what are going to be necessary and what activities are provided to a person. And that's kind of the definition of an ISP. I think about it as it's the story. It's what we're doing, how we're supporting someone, and what's it going to look like. So part of some of the change that we've had in our system is around person-centered planning and kind of a different approach to how services and supports and the ISP come together. Hopefully, some of you have heard of person-centered planning and what that means. In this kind of new approach of where we're at in our system, we've always thought we were person-centered, right? We always knew what our person wanted. We've always kind of felt like, yeah, we're person-centered. We've been doing that since the 90s, right? But now that we've really taken a look at it, it's like, I think we could probably do a few things different, right? We could ask a little more questions. We could talk about discovering the person. So discovering the likes and wants and interests of a person, looking at what is it that makes this person have a good day and a bad day. I like to use my own personal, what makes me have a good day. You know, I need 30 minutes in the morning, just 30 minutes where everybody's still asleep and it's just me and I can just be Beth. Like I'm not mom yet. I'm not the working mom. I'm not having to race around, getting shoes together, getting book bags together and lunches packed. Like I just need that 30 minutes and that allows me to kind of have a minute, right? And when I don't have that, I think about how my day then goes. Now I'm in a rush. Everything's a rush, and I feel that rush all day long because that was really, that's what I need to have a good day. Or coffee before 10 o'clock, right? Any coffee drinkers in the room? I need that coffee, So those are things that help me have a good day. And so when we think about our own lives and the things that make us have a good day, if someone was writing an individualized service plan for me, those would be the things that need to be in there, because that's what helps support me. That's how someone knows how to best approach me. I'm not a morning person. I need till 10 o'clock and drink my coffee, but unfortunately, my hours start really early in that. Person-centered plan also identifies what is important to and important for the individual. Kind of like going back to what makes you have a good day, what makes you have a bad day. Person-centered planning is not all the things that are important to me are the only things talked about, and none of the important for me are talked about. It's really that balance. And when we're talking about important to and important for, and what that means is important to are those things that are important to me, that make me have a good day, make me have a bad day. Detailed things like, I like coffee at 10 o'clock, but I don't just like coffee, right? I like medium roast with hazelnut cream. That's really what's important to me, is to have that every morning. But what may be important for me could be, I need a specific medication every morning, or it's important for my health and safety for me to have specific things in my plan. And so when we're doing person-centered planning, those things have to balance, because that's life, right? We have to make the balance. If our lives were only planned to all the important twos, we'd only just have fun, right? Like that's, we gotta have the balance. It's gotta be both. And so the person-centered plan documents and charts outcomes. So we're no longer talking about skill development and goals. We're talking about outcomes and how holistically we will help a person achieve those outcomes as a team. So a person-driven plan kind of looks like this. It's all the my's. So it's my plan, my dreams, my ambition, my supports, my abilities, my goals, and my services. And when we talk about it's because that person is at the forefront of how those things are determined. And it's listening to that person talk about what is it that they want to do? What is it that they can do? And instead of our system has been really good at coming from a deficit perspective of these are all the things they need because they can't, and thinking about it differently of these are all the things they need because they can, and this is what they want. And so it's very different when we're thinking about person-centered planning and the person driving the plan. So a part of the ISP process, and later Heidi will talk about, we're really good at planning in our system. We plan everything, every little detail. And so part of that requires a team process, and we're very team-oriented in our system, where teams come together to help plan and help create the person-centered plan. So we're going to talk about the roles and responsibilities of each team member. So first, talking about the team. The team is that support network. Those are the people that are involved in the person's life that know them best, that can help that person establish what is important to them, help them establish what is important for them. It can be the team. There's no prescription of who has to be the team in this kind of outlined, this has to be, or it's not a team. That's not true. Every team should look different because we're people, and everything is different to each person, and who's important and who they don't want to the table, those things. So just kind of an outline of maybe the team includes, obviously the person being supported is the first, very important. The SSA or the QIDP, family members and friends. I always talk about, in our system, we do a really good job of identifying paid lives for people. You have a need at home, we'll find you a provider. You need to go to day service, we have a provider that does that, and we create really good paid lives. But sometimes we forget about the people in the person's life that probably knows them best, understands their background, where they came from, where they grew up, those things. And so it's really important that we invite those folks to the table as well. Providers and other professionals, maybe it's the counselor or the psychologist or the doctor that we get input to because they also know the person. And they're a part of the team. Provider, definitely a part of the team. And then the guardian. You guys are important. An important role of the team to help everybody understand and keep kind of on task of what we're advocating for. So the role of the team, to listen to the person, making sure that the person's voice is being heard. That's everybody's role on the team, is to make sure that that's happening. Determine their wants and needs and that balance. How do we find that balance of what they really want and what's important for them, and how do we balance that to make it all come together? It establishes service and support plans, and of course are driven by the person to determine services that are in the best interest of the person. And so that's the role of the team. Everybody's got to come together. And I know if you've ever been on teams where it's just not going well, right? Everybody's got an opinion, right? Everybody's, what if this happens, or what if that happens? And so when we talk about the roles of the team, we have to think about, when we're talking about the best interest of the person, to make sure it makes sense, right? We're not kind of in this scared mode of what if every little thing happens. And so the team's job is to support the people on the team that are kind of in that impasse of what others are wanting and maybe the person doesn't want it, and compromise. The role of the team is to come to compromise as well too, because that's what's going to support the person best. So the role of the Service and Support Administrator, which I'm going to refer to as the SSA because it's a mouthful to say, they establish the budget for their services. So we talked about before, Derek had mentioned the DDP, the Disability Determination Profile. That's an SSA role. They take care of the budget. They determine how much funding is available, what are some alternate funding. If a person is on a waiting list and maybe it's something that they don't have to wait for, we can look at other funding to get that service available or that equipment or what have you. They provide the continuous monitoring of the ISP and services. As our culture is shifting and kind of practices and procedures are changing in the ISP world, kind of getting away from monitoring a little bit, because that kind of gives that feeling of control over, where we're monitoring you, we're making sure it's this watching. We're really talking about discovery. We're talking about how collecting that new information that we learn about someone and how do we incorporate that into the ISP to give less of like a monitoring. And they look at the services, do they make sense? And when a new service or at the ISP, maybe it's a new ISP, it's the SSA's role to coordinate all of the services. One thing I forgot to mention as I'm talking, when we talk about the ISP, usually, typically, traditionally, it's kind of like this one-time event that happens each year, right? It's like, oh, yay, we got our ISP invites. It's time, yay, it's that year. It doesn't need to be like that, right? Really why we've made it such an annual event, it's really about Medicaid paperwork. So it's about, did you get your rights signed off for the year? You understand your rights. Free choice of provider consent. Like there are specific Medicaid paperwork that has to be completed each year that we've just kind of butted up with the ISP writing and approval and kind of revamping services. But the ISP should be a living document, because just like our lives, what was important to me last week, this week, it may not matter anymore. And so the ISP shouldn't just be this annual event and one time a year and everybody gets together. The team should be talking. The team should be talking about what they've learned about the person, and not making it such an annual event. That really the annual event is Medicaid paperwork, and that can be taken care of, right? So, all right, back to roles. The role of the provider is to provide input to the person's plan. These are the folks who are with your loved one day to day, or maybe you are the provider and the guardian, and so you very much understand what that day-to-day looks like, so you can help provide input to the person's plan. And to implement the plan, the provider has this huge responsibility to know every little thing that's in that plan that the whole team is signed off on, and now they're responsible to go and implement it, and that's a huge responsibility. The role of the provider is to advocate for the person as well, to make sure that their voice is heard, and that the person is able to establish the outcomes that they want for their plan. The role of the Qualified Intellectual Disability Professional, which I'll refer to as the Q, or QIDP, much similar to the SSA. They are the person who coordinates services, continuously monitor the plan, and the ICF. In the ICF, the plan is called an IP typically, or an IHP. You'll hear it called different things, but it's all the same, individualized plan. And so the Q is responsible for making sure that's written, coordinated, and everybody's on the same page. So the role of the guardian on the team is to advocate for the person primarily. You're the people who know that person and really to make sure that their voice is heard. Make decisions that are in the best interest of the person. Provide informed consent, making sure that the person understands what their plan says, understands what's happening. That's your role of the guardian. And to say, yes, it's okay if these things happen. This is what I want the provider to do for my loved one. Monitor and coordinate services and maintain eligibility for services. And I always talk about the guardian is kind of in this kind of hold of places. So you have your guardianship rules and probate court, and you're accountable to probate court, and then you also have to understand the DD system and the rules within our system too, and how they all kind of come together. And so the role of the guardian is to do that and to understand and to make sure that everything is fitting together.
So as Beth has been talking about the role of the guardian, one of the things that we do in these continuing education classes is we just rehash one of the most important things we talked about during the 6-hour course. And the first thing we talk about is informed consent decision making. This is something that the Supreme Court and courts have put a lot of emphasis on, is how we go about making decisions as a guardian. Because after all, what a guardian is charged with doing is making decisions on behalf of the individual who does not have the competency to make their own decisions. So when making decisions, as Beth alluded to, we have a number of different roles and obligations, but when making decisions, decision making is giving informed consent. And we know that in Ohio we do that based on what's in the best interest of the individual we're serving. Ohio is a best interest state. But as we talked about in the 6-hour course, best interest is a term that's been qualified, because in Ohio we define best interest as the course of action that best meets the needs of the individual, including consideration of the least intrusive, most normalizing, and least restrictive course of action possible given the needs of the individual. So we qualify our definition of best interest with making sure that we take into consideration what's least intrusive, what's most normalizing, and what's least restrictive. We have a due diligence requirement when we're making decisions. We have an obligation to communicate with the ward and be fully informed about the implications of the decisions we're making. Now, when we're talking about communication, Rule 66 is very repetitive in terms of communication. And I always have people that look at me and say, look, the person I'm guardian for, they have the functioning abilities of someone who might be, 6 months old or a year old or something of that nature. And I readily concede that we have a wide spectrum of abilities to communicate in terms of the individuals we serve. We could line up all the individuals who are served by guardians in this room, and you'd get a wide variety of functioning abilities. Whatever level an individual can communicate on, the guardian has an obligation to communicate with them on that level. So to the extent they can have input into any decision you're making, you have an obligation as part of your due diligence to seek that input from them and incorporate it into the decision you're making. You have an obligation to impose the least restrictive alternative. So when you're given two choices, what imposes the least restrictions on the ward's rights, freedom, and ability to control their own environment? And then just as Beth said, there's person-centered planning in the DD world. We also have a person-centered planning definition in Rule 66, which says, guardians shall strive to balance the ward's maximum independence and self-reliance with the ward's best interest. So what does all this mean? Well, if you think about it in context of what we've been talking about, Beth did a good job identifying these are the people on the team. And the people on the team are going to look at what is our funding source, which goes back to, do we have a waiver available? Do we have local funds available? Do we privately pay? And they're going to look at what's the funding available. They're going to get together as a team. They're going to come up with an ISP. And the ISP is going to identify what can we do to improve the person's life? What services can we provide? And make sure that all that is encompassed in the ISP. The ISP becomes a roadmap for the services and the rights that we want to protect for the individual during the course of their life. So as a guardian, how we fit into that is we're giving informed consent for that ISP. We have to sign off on that ISP. So when we're sitting there at the team table and the team's suggesting this service or that service, that's when we have to make sure that at all times somebody's turning back to the person being served saying, hey, what do you think about this? We've got to do our due diligence. We've got to look at what's least restrictive. If there truly are two choices that are equal in everyone's eyes, then we should probably stop and say, well, which imposes the least restrictions on the ward's rights, freedom, and ability to control their own environment, and go with that route. So that's part of the informed consent decision-making that we as guardians do. It happens when we make medical decisions. It happens when we make decisions at the ISP table, at the team table, and when we're choosing providers, etc. We also have court requirements that we have to comply with. And we have a number of them. As guardian of the person, and again, so today's course, we're talking about the DD system. It's really speaking more to guardians of the person. There's very little, if anything, we're saying today that would apply to guardians of the estate. Guardians of the estate have their own court reporting requirements, and you would have to comply with those if you're a guardian of the estate. But for us that are guardians of the person, of someone who's in the DD system, well, who's guardians of the person, regardless of whether they're in the DD system, we have the same court requirements. And so we have to review these each time. And so the first one I want to point out is one that's really hit home for the DD system, and that is the conflict of interest provision. In Ohio, in the DD system, a family member can be a family member can be a paid provider, an independent paid provider. They can be licensed through the state and paid to be a provider, and they can also be a guardian for that individual. Now, if you're not a family member, let's say it's my neighbor, I cannot be guardian and a paid provider for him if he's my neighbor. But if he's a family member, a blood relative, I can do that. So that's the rule that the DD system came up with, and that's what's always been in place. Well, last year when they passed Rule 66 said a guardian cannot be a paid direct service provider unless it's otherwise approved by the court. And so the minute that rule went into effect, in Ohio, we had hundreds and hundreds of individuals in the DD system that were out of compliance with that rule because they were paid direct service providers of a loved one that they were also the guardian for. And so if you find yourself in that scenario, you need to go back and you need to tell the court. You know, we have, I know a good deal of the probate judges in this state, and I've done this for several clients, and I haven't seen a judge say no yet. They may have questions, and they may want to clarify the scope of the conflict, but judges understand, and again, I'm not a judge and can't speak for judges, but in my experience, judges understand and are very quick to hash through what's in the best interest of the person, and sometimes it is in the best interest for you to consider being a paid provider and for you to also be the guardian. But you need to let the court know that, because the court has the authority to waive that conflict of interest. You're not able to waive that conflict of interest without court approval. So that requires court approval. Next up is change of residence. And this is one that we talk about during the 6-hour course, and we've had a lot of feedback from the courts on change of residence. And it's one where it's kind of slow to get up and running in terms of compliance. So the thing that we've really been told to emphasize is if there's a change of residence, the court will always be involved. So if the ward, if the person you're serving, if their address is changing, if they're moving, the court will always be involved. If they're moving in a lateral move in terms of restrictiveness, if they're moving from one apartment to another apartment, or if they're moving from one ICF to another ICF, or if they're moving from, maybe they live with you and their family and you're moving to a different part of town, that's a lateral move, and the court's required to receive 10 days advance notice in writing. So you have to tell the court in writing 10 days in advance. A lot of courts have standardized forms on which you can tell them about that move. If the move is to a more restrictive setting, so if I'm the guardian for Johnny and Johnny has spent his entire life living with family, and then due to his health conditions, he needs to move into an ICF, an intermediate care facility, that's a more restrictive setting. I have to have court approval. I have seen a number of courts handle this differently. When I ask for court approval, there are some courts that will look at the information you provide them when you're requesting court approval, and they may approve it. I've seen courts send court investigators out to take a look at what's going on. I've seen courts set it for a hearing. I've seen a number of different courts handle this different ways. Your obligation as guardian is to tell the court and ask the court for approval. The other thing you need to understand is, as a team member in the DD system, more likely than not, the other members of that DD system are not going to understand or appreciate this requirement. So you need to be the one that's reminding the team, if the team's meeting, to say, okay, Johnny needs to move from this apartment to this ICF. There's a bed open, let's move him next Tuesday. Sometimes as guardian, it's your job to say, wait a minute, time out, I've got to get court approval. That's a more restrictive setting. Because you're the ones that have the obligation to make sure that this goes back to the court. There is an exception for emergencies. If there's an emergency that exists, you can always move the individual right away and then let the court know as soon as possible thereafter. So there's always an exception for emergencies, but understand the court has to be involved if someone's residence is changing. As guardians, we also still have an obligation to file guardians reports. I know a lot of you in here are guardians and have been guardians for a long time, so this doesn't surprise you or shouldn't surprise you. Most courts now require guardians reports to be filed annually. Some require them to be filed biannually. The guardians report is a form you will get from your probate court and fill it out. If you're new to guardianship, I encourage you to read a guardian's report so you understand what information it is you need to be keeping track of. Accompanying the guardian's report is also supposed to be an annual plan. The annual plan is a new component of guardianship that was created last year when Rule 66 passed. When we went around and did the 6-hour training a year ago at this time, I was telling everyone that they're working on a standardized form for the annual plan, and it'll be available sometime next year, being 2016. Well, it's still not available. It's in the works. I know they have a form that's been proposed, but it's not yet been finalized or adopted. So at this point in time, different counties have different forms or different requirements of guardians in terms of the annual plan. At this time, if you're filing a guardian's report, I would encourage you to first look at your court's website, and then secondly, if you can't find any information on the website, contact the court about what, if anything, they require in terms of the annual plan. There are some courts I know that still aren't requiring the annual plan. They're waiting until a standardized form is adopted. But then I would say the majority of courts have adopted an interim standardized form that they're asking people to submit with their guardian's report. The annual plan is the one that's been proposed, and the last version I saw from the Probate Judges Association that was being proposed was a very straightforward form that isn't going to be burdensome or overly difficult to fill out. It just does a good job of asking you, I think it's literally only 2 or 3 questions about thinking about goals and means to meet the goals for improving the life of the individual you're serving. Reporting abuse, neglect, and exploitation. So when we talk about reporting abuse, neglect, and exploitation, here in a minute, I'm going to turn it over to Heidi, and she's going to talk about reporting abuse, neglect, and exploitation within the DD system. This is a DD course. And within the DD system, we have the MUI and UI process that she'll tell us about. You as guardians, though, you have an obligation to report abuse. You have an obligation to report appropriate allegations of abuse, neglect, and exploitation to the court. Now, I see it as a great benefit if you're a guardian in the DD system, because the DD system has its own investigation process that Heidi will talk about. And so my personal opinion, appropriate allegations of abuse, neglect, or exploitation is a substantiated MUI in the areas of abuse, neglect, and exploitation, which again, Heidi will explain what that means. Substantiated means after the county board did their investigation, they found there was merit to the claim of whatever happened. So I myself believe that being in the DD system makes this a little bit easier because we already have an administrative body that's investigating whatever the allegation is, and then the result of their investigation will clue me in as to whether or not I need to tell the probate court. Now, there's a big exception to that, and I also have to caveat that this is, again, going statewide, and knowing a lot of the judges, there are some judges that may feel differently, and so, that's where you've got to know your local court. The one thing I will tell you, though, is if there's a major, major incident where the person I'm the guardian for is the victim of a crime, I'm going to make sure I tell the court right away. I'm not going to wait on an MUI investigation. I'm going to make sure I tell the person, I'm going to make sure I tell the court right away so they know what I know and they know what's being done. But that in and of itself, reporting that incident of abuse, neglect, and exploitation opens a whole different can of worms. Because you've got to keep in mind that whatever you report does become part of the public record. And so when we taught this class, we initially said, write it all down, write everything, all the detail you can about what happened and tell the court. And then sure enough, I got into a situation where there was a sexual assault on someone, and then you get into this kind of uneasy situation of how much of that do you want in the public record? How much do you really want to write down, put on paper, and then file it with a court that anyone can read? And so you got to use some discretion there and make sure the court knows what you know, but communicate with your court And there's different ways to do that. You want to be a little bit judicious about what you put in the public record and what you don't, but you also want to make sure that you're disclosing to the court, especially if the individual is a victim of a major crime or something of that nature. Lastly, you have an obligation to report if the individual's level of care is not being met. Now this one, when I first read Rule 66, I kind of smiled and squirmed at the same time because I really struggled with what does this mean, reporting to the court that the individual's level of care is not being met. And so having talked with some judges and having been out in practice, reporting the level of care not being met, as a guardian, when you've signed up to become a guardian, you're undertaking the responsibility to try to help make decisions on behalf of someone and to be their advocate, to be their mouthpiece, to get the best supports you can in place for them. But there are certainly times where they may refuse your help, or they may reject your help, or other members at the team table may disagree as to what supports are necessary, and it may change what the ultimate picture looks like. My personal opinion, after having spoken with some different courts, is I don't think courts expect you or want you to run to the court every single time that a certain provision you think should be in the ISP is not included in the ISP. I mean, that's why they're appointing guardians, to go through those day-to-day conversations, to go through those day-to-day processes to make those decisions on behalf of individuals. But if you've exhausted every effort you know of to exhaust, and you are just simply not able to put the person you're serving in a situation where their basic needs are being met, then yes, you have an obligation to report that to the court. And again, you would report that in writing by putting it in writing, here's the deficits in this person's life, and I've tried to tackle them, and I'm not able to. But under Rule 66, you have an obligation to report that back to the court that their level of care is not being met. And that doesn't mean you're not doing your job, because I can tell you from experience that one of the most challenging things you can do is have someone who's incredibly high functioning, and they certainly need a guardian due to whatever deficits may exist in their life, but at the same time they are stubborn and they just refuse any help. And that's tough because we're not a police force. We can't tie people up and make them go to the doctor's appointment we want them to go to. And so it leaves us in an uneasy situation. But we do have an obligation to report that back to the court if the level of care is not being met. So, all right, and just Heidi's going to come up and talk about MUIs and UIs.
So throughout the morning, I think if you have learned anything about our system, the main thing you should have learned is that we are very planful. There's a process for everything, right? There's a process for getting a waiver, a process for some conversations if you're going to move into an ICF, process for eligibility, process for planning, who does what to support the person. There's a process for everything. We try to be as planful as we can for a service delivery system. And those efforts are really just to try to make things go as smoothly as possible. There's a lot of different pieces and parts and folks who need to know things, and we really want people to have the best lives that they can, to be the most successful. And then life happens, right? And things do not go according to that plan. Beth talked about the planning meeting and how it should be fluid, and we keep coming back to the table with the things that we've learned about a person. Sometimes things happen that didn't have the best outcome. That would be why we have a UI-MUI system. So incidents, that's what we call them. MUIs, what's an MUI? It's a major unusual incident, usually that is suspected or an actual occurrence where it's believed that the health and welfare of the individual may be adversely affected or the person was placed at risk. Some key points with MUIs: alleged, suspected, or actual occurrence. That initiates the MUI. Reason to believe the person's at risk. So these are significant types of things. Like Derek mentioned, exploitation, abuse, those are MUIs, and there are different types of abuse. But also, these are for folks who are receiving services or would be receiving services because of the MUI. So if somebody has a medical emergency and ends up in the hospital, admitted to the hospital, that could result in an MUI. If somebody injures themselves and ends up with a significant number of stitches, there's a magic number. I want to say it's more than 5, right? That's how specific MUIs are. That would be an MUI. You know, if somebody's neglected, that would be an MUI. But when the initial report is written, an investigation happens after the fact to determine if it truly is an MUI. And in some cases, you know, it's a pretty in-depth investigation. Interviews of the person, interviews of staff, interviews of anybody who may have been involved. And then there's an outcome, which means the MUI is either substantiated or it was not. One way or the other, that's kind of the MUI process. Throughout all of that, there's also a prevention plan. So it's kind of like, what are we going to do to make sure this doesn't happen again? Because we're always trying to plan, right? Might feed back to the ISP, might not. UIs are kind of the same thing, but to a lesser degree. So there's not really a health and welfare risk. Let's say that somebody, you know, bumped into the podium and maybe they bruise easy and they had a big bruise on their arm. That might be an unusual incident. Or if somebody tripped but there was no injury, they did fall but there wasn't an injury, that might be a UI. So unusual incidents are things that are not consistent with the normal day-to-day operations and the way things go, but they don't reach the level of health and welfare or risk for it to be an MUI. Still require a prevention plan. So let's say that UI may have been, you know, that I was walking out the door and I tripped on the rug. Well, maybe I've tripped on that rug before. The prevention plan may simply be, let's get rid of the rug, you know? Or if a new staff person did something that wasn't in the plan, the prevention plan might be to assure that all staff are trained prior to working with somebody. When there is a UI or MUI, it's all about our service delivery system and who has to report. So providers, any paid provider of service, so whether they're waiver providers, ICF, or locally funded providers, they're required to report. County board staff, anybody who's receiving Medicaid money is required to report. Are families required to report? Well, if they're paid providers, they are. If they're not, then no, they're not required to report. So sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't, depending upon what hat they're wearing, because we have a lot of folks who wear more than one hat. Sometimes it might be in the best interest of your loved one to, if something happens, to let the provider know anyway, you know, just so, because it might change the services needed by that person. Or if you feel it is something that needs investigated, let the provider know and they can make the determination, let the county board decide if something was an MUI or not. All right, so we're going to take a break. It is about 2:16 by that lovely clock at the back of the room, so 15 minutes, and we'll be back right after 2:30. Thank you.
Okay, if I can get your attention. We had some good questions submitted. First one is, which two developmental centers are closing? Montgomery and Youngstown. So, let's see. What if you continue to disagree with the physician's course of treatment? So, I mean, keep in mind, as guardian, you're not required to just rubber stamp a course of treatment because a physician prescribes it. Having said that, if you're going to veer off from a physician's course of treatment, I would certainly hope you're getting a second opinion and giving a lot of hard thought and research to that as to why you're doing that, because generally speaking, again, it's a very fact-specific situation. There are certainly times where you would not follow a physician's course of treatment, and you're certainly not required to, which is, I think, the question. But if you're going to veer off from a physician's course of treatment, I would hope you're doing a lot of homework and that you understand why, and the implications of not following whatever that course of treatment may be. Is certification for this class sent to county court, or do we deliver? So at the end of this course, Chris will come up and everyone will get a certificate, and then we will encourage you to write your guardianship case number on your certificate and then file it with your county probate court. Different courts will have different ways of doing that. Some of the remote sites may give you different local instructions, but you're going to want to make sure the certificate that you get today gets filed with the county court which your guardianship is out of. There's, let's see, no waiting list for community residential services for people in ICF. Really? Group home, etc. have waiting lists. That's true. I mean, there are group homes that do have waiting lists. That's absolutely true. People getting out of ICFs or people deciding to try moving out of ICFs, as Heidi said, would first have to go through counseling, options counseling, and then that's why we do counseling, so that we can try to educate and make sure people understand and appreciate what their options are. So, and they're, again, I mean, ICFs, while the trend statewide is to downsize and move out of ICFs, there are certainly some people that need to stay in ICFs. I mean, it's not that, please don't misunderstand what I'm saying or Heidi or Beth or anyone saying that we don't think there should be any ICFs. I mean, there's absolutely a place and a need for certain individuals to live in ICFs because it would be a very hard transition for some people. And then there is an APSE-specific question that I'm happy to talk to anyone about after the course is over. And then let's see, it says, please speak to and help me, a guardian, understand the rationale and inherent conflict between pursuing a ward's best interest and least restrictive alternative. Which of these wins? And so it is confusing, and we're going to talk about that. We're going to go into rights next, and this hits right into what we're going to talk about with rights. It's that balancing act. There's no one-size-fits-all approach, and so whoever sent in this question, we will try to get to that in this next section as we talk about rights. Who must report UI or MUI? Is there a distinction between must and may? May a guardian report?
Providers of service in the DV system must. There's no must or may. They must. Now, guardians, as long as you're not the provider, you have the may option, or people who are not required reporters.
All right, that one is duplicative. Can there be a co-guardian? My wife would like to be co-guardian of our adult child with Down syndrome. This is a county-specific question. There are some counties that allow co-guardianship and encourage co-guardianship. And they see it as a great way to do succession planning and have someone else lined up to be the guardian if something happens to the guardian. There are other counties that absolutely will not allow co-guardianship. And that is because inherently, at some point, the two co-guardians are going to be fighting, and then it's back clogging up the court system when they have two guardians that cannot come to agreement on what should happen in a certain situation. So there's not a statewide answer to this question. You have to know your local probate court, and I would contact your local probate court about whether or not co-guardianship is an option where you reside. We have an aide that comes to our home to help with our son. Our son is sometimes disobedient, disrespectful, and something. We tell the aide to remove privileges such as TV or Wi-Fi when he is not obedient. The aide says he can't do this because the son has rights. This question epitomizes what our next section is about. There have been a lot of changes in the system with respect to rights and something called the behavior support rule, and we're going to lead into that here in just a second. But this question is actually a very good lead into that. There is a follow-up question: where and how do you report UIs and MUIs? And so you report UIs or MUIs. All county boards have someone designated to accept reports of UIs and MUIs, a 24-hour call-in number. Any county board employee is required to take a report of an MUI. They can't brush you off and say go somewhere else. They have to take a report of an MUI, or at least walk you to whoever can take the report of the MUI. Does a paid provider need to inform the court or get approval if they are a direct service provider to a family member? If you're the guardian and a paid provider, yes, you need to get approval from the court. Is a licensed waiver facility a group home? Yes. I mean, a group home isn't actually a defined term, but a licensed waiver facility is often what's referred to as a group home. So when you hear that term, group home, Most often, that's what someone's referring to as a licensed waiver facility. And then there's another question about individuals moving out of ICFs and being told that they have to move out of ICFs. And so again, to my knowledge, no one's being told they have to move out of ICFs. ICFs are going through a downsizing process to try to get Ohio more in line with what the model looks like in other states and to comply with federal mandates. So we're trying, Ohio as a state is trying to go through the downsizing process. There are all kinds of different opinions on whether Ohio is doing it too quickly or too slowly, depending on who you ask. And so there are a lot of individuals who will have to look at other options, but to my knowledge, no one's being made to move out at this time. But the next thing we want to move into is rights, because as you heard just from those questions, we always get questions on rights. You know, as working in guardianship and representing a number of guardians, I get questions all the time about rights. And they're some of the most confusing questions I get because the questions are often something that's remarkably gray and where two reasonable minds could have different opinions on what should happen and what shouldn't happen. So we've got to start with the basics of what is a right and what are we talking about. So before we even get to this behavior support rule or anything else, let's just talk about rights. You know, we know what our rights are, and we all are very aware that we have rights, and we know where those rights come from, and we're protective of those rights. All individuals, no individual wants to see their rights impinged or infringed upon or taken away from them. So we have the textbook definition of a right on the screen, but we also know that every human has rights. You know, as United States citizens, we all have rights. And the important thing, and this sometimes has been lost in history in our dealings with guardianship, is that guardianship does not terminate those rights. An individual does not lose rights just because a guardian is appointed. Instead, it's not that the individual loses guardian, but rather it changes how those rights are advocated for, who has the authority to exercise those rights. So if I'm appointed the guardian for someone, it's not my job to come into their life and say, you've lost all your rights, I'm going to put you in a bubble and keep you safe. It's my job to come into your life and say, okay, I'm here to help you exercise your rights. How can I help you advocate for your rights to maximize the quality of your life? There's a distinction there, and sometimes in history that's been lost, and that's part of the problems we saw that led to some of the revamping of guardianship in Ohio and across the nation. I mean, Ohio, again, is still following other states that have already passed similar rules and have even more stringent education requirements, and a lot of that is driven by concerns that sometimes rights are too arbitrarily infringed upon when someone has a guardian appointed. So, what rights are we talking about? Before we even get there, the other reason rights are important is because they impact all areas of our life. You know, our dignity, our self-respect, it all comes from rights. So when we infringe upon someone's rights, whether we realize it or not, regardless of their functioning ability, a lot of times individuals will recognize that they're being treated differently or that they're not being treated the same way. And when they recognize that, it absolutely impacts their life in ways that I think a lot of times we don't readily see unless we're really paying attention. So we have to be mindful that rights impact all aspects of life. So what rights are we talking about? Well, if you recall in the 6-hour course, we broke it into really 3 categories. We have procedural rights. Procedural rights are those rights that are specifically built into Ohio's guardianship statutes and other statutes that protect the individual's right to due process. An individual subject to guardianship has the right on an annual basis to request a review hearing. And when they request a review hearing, that's a hearing they're entitled to in front of the probate court where they request that review hearing. A hearing will be set, and at that hearing, the guardian bears the burden of proving that the ward is still incompetent and still needs a guardian. And that can be, you know, frankly, that can be uneasy sometimes, because sometimes there's cases where you go to a review hearing and the individual, in your opinion, clearly needs a guardian. But you have a good working relationship with that person because you're their guardian. Well, now you have to go into court and sit at a table right next to them and explain to a judge or magistrate all the reasons that person is still incompetent. And that can cause some strain and some uneasiness. I mean, one of the things that has always bothered me, whether it's about, and it's not just the DD system, but DD system, guardianship, is anywhere else, is there are a number of times where we're put in a position where we have to describe the deficits of an individual right in front of them. if you've been through the DD system, I mean, even with, my own daughter going through the co-ed and things of that nature, you have to take them to these meetings and describe the deficits right in front of them. And guardianship is the same way. You have to go to hearings and describe the deficits, what's causing them to need a guardian right in front of them. And that's very uneasy and very uncomfortable sometimes. But they have the right to hear why you think they need a guardian. And they have the right to contest the continuing existence of the guardianship. They have the right to an attorney. They have the right to have a record of that hearing made. They have the right to appeal if they don't like the decision. And those are the procedural rights that are built in to make sure they have due process and that they're not lost within this system. They have fundamental rights. Those are those everyday rights that we all enjoy, the right to express our own religious beliefs and to have our own religious practices, not have those dictated to us, the right to vote, the privilege of driving a car. There are lots of individuals with a guardian who drive a car every day. There are many that do not and could not, but there are many that do. And so those all fall under those fundamental rights and privileges. And then there's that third category we talk about in the 6-hour course, that everything else category that also falls under self-determination and independence. And that's all those really gray areas where you get into things that start to really make you uncomfortable because you don't know, do they have the right to do this or not? And the statement I always turn back on individuals is, well, do you have the right to do that? When we say they have rights, I'm not saying that an individual with a developmental disability who has a guardian has the right to go out and set a forest on fire. Clearly they do not, no more so than you do. But all of us at break time had the right to go outside and smoke a cigarette. And so those are the kind of rights where sometimes it makes people uncomfortable, but those rights aren't necessarily lost just by virtue of someone having a guardian appointed. Rights under Rule 66. Rule 66, a large part of why Rule 66 was passed had to do with protecting and enforcing rights of individuals subject to guardianship. And so you have a copy of Rule 66 in the very back of your materials. And just as a refresher, when I refer to Rule 66, that's rules of superintendents that are passed by the Ohio Supreme Court that pertain to different courts in Ohio and pertain to guardianship, pertain to probate courts and guardianship. And one of the things about Rule 66, is I will tell you, it is remarkably redundant. It says the same thing over and over. It just rephrases it, and it's repetitive in that way. And the things that it is repetitive about are communication and least restrictive alternatives, okay? Taking the least restrictive course of action. So it's very repetitive in that way, and that it requires guardians to go back and communicate with the individual. It requires you to involve the individual in decisions, whether you're making medical decisions. One of the questions we had is what happens when a guardian disagrees with a doctor's course of action or doctor's prescription? And that can create an uneasy situation. What can create an even more uneasy situation is when the ward disagrees. Because then you have to really do some assessments as do they understand what they're disagreeing to? Are they physically refusing? Because again, as a guardian, we can consent to treatment. We can't force treatment. If they're in a hospital setting, admitted to a hospital, treatment can be forced, but that's not very often. As a guardian, we can consent to treatment. We can't force. We can't tie someone up and make them take a shot they don't want to get. So that's where sometimes we run into challenges as guardians. End-of-life decisions, we have an obligation to be apprised of what they want and what their desires are in end-of-life decisions. And again, that requires some awkward conversations sometimes. You've got to assess what an individual's functioning ability is and try to communicate on whatever level you can to understand what their preferences are in end-of-life situations. Right to privacy. Individuals have, right within Rule 66, they have the right to privacy in terms of their personal space and their information. To the extent it's not unhealthy or unsafe, they have the right to privacy with respect to their space, their personal space. We all appreciate our personal space and we're all protective of that. They also have the right to privacy about their information. I've said it before and I say it frequently, so much of guardianship plays out in the public record that we fall into this trap of thinking that it's open conversation with friends, and it's not. Individuals that need to know what's going on in the person's life would include those individuals that are on the person's support team. So Beth identified the team that supports this individual. They need to know what's going on in that person's life. You need to share information with them. The person that you went to high school with, that you run into at Applebee's while you're having dinner, you don't need to tell them about the latest health, problems of the person you're serving as guardian, because there is that right to privacy there, and you want to be mindful of that. Why is all this important? Why so much emphasis on rights? Well, there's no greater way to lose a good night's sleep than to get a computer and Google historical treatment of individuals with developmental disabilities. Throughout history, we have done a terrible job with how we've treated individuals with developmental disabilities. There's a very brutal past associated with the treatment of individuals with developmental disabilities. And knowing that, we're trying to improve. You don't have to go back far in history to see that, that treatment of individuals with developmental disabilities. I've told a story before. I, again, have a daughter with Down syndrome. First time I took my daughter with Down syndrome back home where I grew up, which was in West Virginia, I took my daughter, my wife and I, we took our daughter to church with my grandparents, and there's a lady I've known my entire life who, came up, saw our daughter, did what people always do, pat her on the head like she was a puppy or something, and told us what a cute girl she was, and then she proceeded to basically kind of cry the rest of the church service. I thought it was so strange and out of character. We get home, I asked my grandmother, why was so-and-so crying the whole time during church service? She proceeds to tell me something I didn't know. When she was much younger, she had had a baby who was born with Down syndrome. Her baby with Down syndrome had been taken off to an institution and had died a few years later. And it really kind of sunk into me just how recently in past we had a situation where individuals haven't always been treated as great as they should in terms of what was best. And in fairness, at that time, people truly believed that was best. And we've moved past that with more information and more knowledge, and we're trying to continue moving in that direction because we know that the more normalization that takes place in an individual's life, the better they will develop and the more meaningful their life will be. So we want to be protective of that. I want to make sure that people understand having a disability doesn't diminish his or her rights. So, all right, now Heidi will come up and talk more about rights, and then once we talk about rights, then we'll start transitioning into the new rules and when rights can be restricted and the behavior support rule, and Heidi will make all of that crystal clear.
Thank you. Okay, so in the middle of your handout, if you just let it naturally fall open where the staple was, there's a one-page list. It's the rights of individuals with disabilities. There are 24 of them. These are kind of what we're going to go over a little bit. Anybody who works in the DD system is trained on the rights of individuals with disabilities every single year. Individuals who receive services in our system receive a notification of their rights every single year. A lot of places, not everywhere. Sometimes when I talk, I tend to generalize, but I don't mean to be all-inclusive. But many, many places for many, many years, what this has amounted to was that page with a signature line on the bottom that's handed out. Here's your rights. Do you understand your rights? Read and sign. Here's the rights of the individuals you work for. Do you understand these? Read and sign. No explanation, not a lot of information about them, but it was a requirement, so people have done it for a long time just like that. And I know this because I work in our compliance unit, so I go out and I see these read and sign signatures everywhere I go. Not everywhere, but most places. Things have changed over the past couple of years, and we're trying to provide additional resources. On the department's website, when I say the department, I mean DODD, we have a workspace where we have a lot of resources, training materials, and things like that now available to people. We actually have an online course about the rights of individuals with disabilities on there, where it kind of walks you through on a computer. I think it would work on a smartphone. Yeah, it will walk you through a 15 to 20-minute course, and it does a really good job of thinking about and explaining the rights of individuals. There are also some videos online. If you YouTube Rights of Individuals in Ohio, they'll pop up. I think Cuyahoga County Board developed one, and folks can find it there. We're starting to see more and more people utilizing those kind of resources as they want people to be more aware of just what they're talking about when they're talking about the rights of individuals with disabilities. So when we think about them, this list of 24 items, like one of them is simply to attend any church, temple, mosque, or religious service. All of these made this list for a reason, right? And what that really means is if I have a disability, I can go to any church that I want to, or none if I don't. It's up to me, it's my choice. What it does not mean is that if I live in a waiver setting, a group home, a whatever you want to call it, and I receive services, maybe I can't go out into my community alone, that I go to my provider's church, which may be a complete different religion than mine. That's not what it means. It really means that I get to go to whatever church, temple, or mosque I want. So sometimes people have a hard time with that. You know, sometimes it's hard to find a provider who's okay with attending a different church. So those are kind of things that we should be asking during provider selection also. Folks have the right to vote, learn about the laws in their community. No matter what your disability, you have the right to vote. It's that simple. Should be explained to somebody. Lots of places provide different types of assistance, and folks have the right to vote. The right about working and making money. Sometimes people get nervous. When somebody with disabilities receives Medicaid, sometimes the folks that support them get nervous about them making money. They're fearful that they might lose their Medicaid. There are a whole lot of things in place right now to prevent that from happening. So if somebody has a disability, they still have the right to work. They still have the right to make money, and there are a lot of things that can help them still be eligible for services nowadays. The next group of them, they have the right to complain. That's a hard one. You know, if you're living in a home and you have staff who come in and help you out every day, and those are the people you have the strongest relationships with, they're the people you see every day, but maybe you don't like something, sometimes it's hard to complain, whether you might be fearful of retribution or, you know, you just don't want that staff person to get in trouble. You know, maybe they're texting on their cell phone when they're driving and it makes you nervous, but you don't want to tell on them because you really like them. You know, people have the right to complain and to, you know, let things be known that they don't like, and they shouldn't be afraid to do that. Folks have the right to refuse medication that they don't want or to be held down if what they're doing is not hurting themselves or others. This one has been a big change in our system, especially the being held down for medical treatment. We've had lots of conversations over the past couple years with a lot of people related to dental appointments, okay, and the use of papoose boards, and tying somebody down just to get their teeth cleaned. That is not okay. Unless there's a risk of harm, it is not okay. Look at the next group. I knew I was going to go one too far. Okay. Folks have the right to voice their opinions and make decisions. I think Derek's done a good job of talking about considering the best interest of the person, seeing what they think, how they feel. Individuals have the right to use their money to pay for things they need and want. So making decisions about what they spend their money on. Having privacy, personal privacy, that's a right. You know, and some of these are things that I personally would take for granted. You know, if I only have $5 in my purse and I want to spend it on a Starbucks coffee, I spend it on a Starbucks coffee, right? If I had a disability, somebody would probably try to talk to me for 15 minutes to let me know that that's probably not a good idea because I won't get paid till Friday and we'll travel down a long road and I probably won't buy that Starbucks coffee. But somebody with a disability has that same right. Like we said, there are 24 of them altogether. The last page, the top one, every time I see it, it's one of my very favorites. I used to kind of go around to places that were struggling with individual rights and behavior supports in different parts of the state. And I used to do a lot of trainings on behavior supports and on individual rights. And when I used to think about the rights, I used to kind of think, this is really my let's be nice to people training. That's it. Let's be nice. And isn't it a shame that we have to teach people to be nice and to be respectful to people no matter what their disability? And you know, that's really a huge one for me. It's just about being nice and treating people the same way we would want to be treated, just like everybody else. Giving people the right to have friends, to be able to have their own things and use them. That's another one we've struggled with in our system, right? Because a lot of times people have programs, people have plans, and when somebody's having a really bad day, the first thing we do is take away something they care about the most. So if you didn't get your 6 stickers for the day, you're going to lose your radio that night, right? When we're having a bad day, the things we need the most are the things that make us feel comfortable, make us feel a little more relaxed, help us have a better day. We don't need those things yanked from us. And that's one of our rights, so that would be a restriction. Another example of that I thought about, that I often use myself as an example of, would be to have your own things. So we have a lot of folks in our system who have lived in institutions before, who have had their things stolen, you know, taken away, gone to work, came back, and something was missing. So we seem to have a lot of folks who like to load up their backpack and take it to work with them. There's always somebody that has a problem with that. Somebody who doesn't think they should do that. Or I read one woman's plan one time. She had a multitude of necklaces, and her plan said she will wear 2 necklaces to work and no more than 2 necklaces. Her staff will help her pick out 2 in the morning, right? I said, I have 1 bracelet on today, 1 bracelet, 1 Fitbit, and 1 hair tie. Sometimes I have 7 or 8 bracelets. Sometimes they get in the way of my work. Yep. Sometimes I have to take them off if I'm going to be doing a lot of typing because they're in the way, but I do it. But I wish there was somebody who was at my house in the morning to say, hey, pick 2, just 2. Nope, no more. Probably wouldn't go over very well for whoever that person was, right? But because I don't have a disability, nobody does that to me. So it's really about treating people like people. So hopefully, more and more people in our system are starting to advocate for the rights of the people that they serve and the folks that we serve. There are a lot of groups around Ohio that help do that. The Ohio Self-Determination Association and People First are both groups, have a lot of local chapters. If you are interested and you're not sure, you can reach out to Beth or I and we can let you know how to contact them. But they are groups that help people become strong self-advocates as well as learn to advocate for other folks in the system. Lots of local options. There's also a family advisory council at our department. It is a great resource for families. I'm thinking that there are some local chapters in other counties, but the State Department one, they meet monthly here in Columbus. They have a big email list. They do a lot of trainings, all kinds of things that are very supportive of families. If you need information about that, just let us know afterwards. So when we think about rights, treating people like people, popping disability bubbles, you know, treating folks the same, we have to think about the dignity of risk, right? Nobody ever makes all the perfect decisions that lead to no problems in our lives. None of us. Whether we have disabilities, whether we don't, it just doesn't happen. So trying to constantly pursue a course of action that is only going to lead to success just isn't very logical because it's not realistic. That's not how we function. Not how we function as people. We need to be planful and support people, try to educate people, help them the best way that they can to make the best decisions. But we really need to move away from thinking that we're always going to be successful. So here's a quote. There can be healthy development in risk-taking, and there can be crippling indignity and safety. So it's really about finding that middle ground, right? So you got to be able to take chances to grow as a person, you know, but be careful at the same time and as planful as we can. I was at a training once and I heard somebody say that safe and miserable is not okay, right? It's just not. But happy and dead is not an option either, right? So it's about finding that middle ground and really helping support somebody to be the happiest that they can in their life. So there's been a huge shift in thinking in our system over the past couple years, and Beth is going to start talking about that.
So yeah, as you can hear, there's lots of shift in thinking is the only way to really talk about it. When we kind of started this kind of path down, learning about the revised behavior support role, it was evident that there had to be this shift in culture, shift in thinking, how we approach people, how we think about people's lives and kind of unsiloing lives. So not thinking about the person just at home, not thinking about the person just at day service, but really thinking about what is it that they need to live, to live their lives like you and I do. And so shift in thinking, really thinking about, as a system, we've done a great job of always thinking about deficits or thinking about, well, what's wrong with them? Why do they do that? Why are they doing that? Why are they behaving this way? Or why do they react this way? And instead of thinking about what's wrong with you, we really need to start thinking about what happened to you. And that's different when we talk about, I think about a person, I typically tell this story about a person that I had the opportunity to get to know where they grew up in this system with a timeout room. And so every time he would come in for his ISP meeting, his individualized service plan meeting, you know, it was a group of 7 of us. We'd come in the room and close the door. And when we would do that, he would have this really horrific negative reaction where he actually had to leave the room. And we would say, what is wrong with him? Why does he do that? Every time we close the door, what's the big deal? We've been doing meetings for years. Like, what is wrong with him? So when we started to think differently, it was about what happened to him. And so for him, every time he was brought into a room and the door was closed, guess what that meant to him? Punishment, timeout, I'm in trouble, some kind of control over me, right? And we didn't take the time to stop and think differently, like, maybe we should stop doing that, right? I mean, do we have to have a meeting in a room where you have to shut the door? Why don't we ask him where he wants to have his meeting? Let's make it about him. And so having that different kind of conversation to say, what happened to you? Help me understand how to support you, or help me understand how to not make you feel that way or have you triggered that way. And we do a really good job in our system. I always say we're like really good historians. Like, we collect all this information and we get documentation and we keep really good notes and case notes and we pile all this history all together. But what do we do with that history? Usually, it either frames someone's reputation, right? They become the biter, the hitter, however you want to describe that person. Instead of, we never take that, I shouldn't say never, we're starting to take that and look at that person differently to say, it makes sense why he does that, because look what happened back here when he was younger, or last year, or 2 weeks ago. Our folks that are in our system, they do endure a lot. We're all learning, and we're all learning together sometimes. So there's this culture shift and shift in thinking to think about what does history tell us, and what do we do with it. There's also a thought about more about support strategies than restrictive strategies. How do we support a person through that? Using some person-centered tools, which I've talked about before, taking a deeper dive to understand and understanding why. And so our behavior support role has some changes in it that have made us think differently. And I think about the role not in terms of a role that has taken something away from the field, but it's actually kind of given it back. It's more of an advocacy role that says, let's look at people's rights. Let's look at why are we doing what we're doing. And so a lot of times Heidi and I will get emails that say, can we do this or can't we do this? It's black and white, right? That's not real life. We have to ask why. Why are you doing what you're doing? Making sense of what's happening. Just because you've always done it and it's always worked, because you're still doing it 10 years later and it's working, right? That doesn't mean it's okay to continue to do it. You have to think differently. And so when we're talking about that shift in thinking, that's what we're talking about. So at the department, as we've kind of trailed down this person-centered philosophy, person-centered planning process and thinking differently, just wanted to build kind of a foundation or guiding principles about what do we mean by a person-centered plan, and what are those elements in a plan that say, yep, this is person-centered, or because there is a huge definition. Like Derek talked about before, like it's in the guardianship rule, it's now in insurance and CMS rules at the federal level, and everybody's talking about person-centered planning. But here are our philosophy, our guiding principles. But it's not prescribing one school of thought either. So this is, again, just guiding principles. So when we talk about person-centered planning, we're looking for comprehensive understanding of the person. When we think about a comprehensive understanding, we've looked at history, we've looked at what's happened to the person, really looking at what happens at home, what happens at day service, what happens at their employment, what happens when they go to the grocery store. So really looking at everything comprehensively to understand the person. Empowering informed choices. And when we talk about choices, typically in our system it's like, do you want A or B? Right? That's not really choices. C, thank you. But what we're talking about here is informed choices, where we say, what do you want for your life? What are your outcomes? What is that you want to achieve? And we take that and we say, okay, let's look at how do we get there, and making informed choices from that. And empowering those informed choices, exposing people to things that maybe they don't know it's possible. We are involving trusted supports. So I talk about, we do a really great job of providing people really, really good paid lives, because we're planners, right? We plan it all. We have a provider set up, we have your transportation, we get you all kind of packaged together. But a lot of times what we forget are the people kind of on the outside of all of that, the family members, the person at church that they sit with, their friends. Who are their friends? Do they have friends? Have we given that opportunity as well? And then increasing community membership. This is huge. And I always think community membership isn't about a job, right? That doesn't make you a part of your community just because you have a job in the community, as we like to describe. Community membership is, you're a part of something. When you're not there, somebody asks where you are. And so I had this opportunity when I worked at the county board to play on an intramural softball team. It was just in a rec league. People with developmental disabilities played on it. Just people kind of just gathered together because we like to play softball. And there was a gentleman there, and he was served by a local county board. And one day, he was the catcher, I should tell you that. He was an amazing catcher. He knew everybody's scoop. He knew what to do. He kept us all together, and would often yell at me if I missed the ball on first base or something. He was a good catcher. He kept us all together. So one day he missed a game. We didn't think much about it. We knew he wasn't going to be there. He'd done what he needed to do as a good team member to let us know. And the umpire comes up and says, "Hey, where's Tom? Is he okay?" So it was like that light bulb went off, like, Tom's a part of this community, this softball community. He didn't need to be a part of Special Olympics or any kind of siloed off into something. He just needed to find where he belonged, and he belonged there. They missed him when he was gone. You would miss Tom if you knew him because he's amazing. So that's what we're talking about, increasing community membership. Where can a person go to start to belong somewhere? And it doesn't have to be something like DD specific. It can be lots of different avenues. Plans and services are driven by the person. This is where we talk about, the person is who says what they want, right? Or that person has somebody that advocates for what they want. And that's where plans and services become driven by the person, not by the professionals. So with the new behavior, with the revised behavior support role, someday I'll stop calling it the new. The revised behavior support role. What's different from before? And so it's really made us do a whole lot of work on the front end to say, why is it that a restrictive measure needs to be put in place? What is it that we've tried before, creative measures? It kind of makes us do a little more work than just saying, yep, here's a restrictive measure. And so the revised rules is going to limit the use of restrictive measures. It's going to make us do some other creative work first. One thing that's been huge too is it applies to everybody. So any provider of specialized services, ICF, county board, our DCs, everybody alike, all falls under and kind of goes and adheres to the same rule. It also requires behavior support strategies to be incorporated into the ISP or the IP. So no longer will you sign off and get 2 plans. So the support strategies are interwoven into the ISP or the IP, and they are pertinent to where the restrictive measure needs to be. So it's not, here's your behavior section anymore in a plan, or here's your behavior plan. It's all interwoven, and it should reflect what supportive strategies are necessary to make that person successful in that activity, in that environment, what have you. But it's not this kind of pulled out separate thing. None of us operate in a silo, right? So it's not like, here I am at work, and here I am at home, and here I am when I'm driving the car. Like, I'm Beth, right? And I need different supports no matter where I'm at. And so people should know that about me. It outlines who can conduct assessments and develop strategies. This was a little bit of a change. It kind of put some requirements and a level of expertise on strategies that are used and created and implemented into a plan and written. And who can conduct assessments. That was a little different too. Again, another layer of that expertise to make sure that we're getting good, holistic assessments completed. It establishes new requirements for human rights committees, and this has been a big change too. We kind of cheer when we hear stories about human rights committees who have pushed back to teams that say, I don't think you've done everything before you've embedded and put in a restrictive measure into this person's life. When a team needs to go back and maybe consider some other things. And so the Human Rights Committee too has a new balance to it where we have truly a 50-50 representation of professionals, people being supported and or family members. And so that's been huge too. Kind of different. In the rule, let's see, I think that's it. There is a section about prohibitive measures, and this isn't new necessarily. There are some added ones, but this isn't necessarily a new rule, though. These have always been prohibitive measures within our system. It's just now we're really taking a look at them and seeing what they mean. So prone restraint, a restraint anytime somebody is face down and being held into a restraint that could be on the floor or against the wall, that's prohibited. The use of restraint that has potential to restrict breathing or it's medically contraindicated. Use of a restraint that causes pain or harm. Disabling a person's communication device. Denial of breakfast, lunch, dinner, snacks, or beverages. Placing a person in a room with no light. And subjecting a person to damaging or painful sound. And so I know when you read through this list, you're like, gosh, like really, we gotta put this in writing that we can't do this to people. And it kind of lends back to the part where Derek talked about the history of treatment of people with developmental disabilities that have derived from this list. And so I think about prohibitive measures, wow, yes, it's terrible that we have to put it in writing, that you can't do this to people, but it shows that we're starting to recognize that we know better, so we do better. We know differently, so we do differently. And so when we look at the rest of the prohibitive measures, one's application of electric shock to a person's body, subjecting a person to any humiliating or derogatory treatment, squirting a person with any substance as an inducement or consequence for behavior, and using any restrictive measure for punishment, retaliation, instruction, or teaching at the convenience of providers or as a substitute for specialized services. So that one has definitely has created some conversation. When we're talking about why are we doing a restrictive measure? Why is it that this is a restraint that's necessary? And kind of when Heidi talks about intent, what is the intent of the restrictive measure? And sometimes we have to talk about, is it for the convenience of the provider? Or is it that we're using it to teach somebody something instead of maybe thinking about it differently? And that traditional of taking away what the one thing that the person likes as a way to earn it back, to kind of mitigate some of that control over the person and more of seeing yourself as more of a support versus a control over the person's life. So, all right. Heidi's going to talk about restrictive measures and some of the rules that come out when we talk about risk of harm, likelihood of legal sanction. Thanks, Heidi.
Thank you. So sometimes when people think about the behavior support rule, sometimes we get a lot of question and a lot of concern where, oh, that rule won't let us do this, or, oh, we can't do that because of that rule. But let's think about it a little bit differently. What the behavior support rule does do is it allows us to restrict somebody's rights in certain situations. That's what it does. When there are kind of some out of control things going on, it allows us to do some things that we wouldn't normally be able to. So when there's a risk of harm or a likelihood of legal sanction because of what somebody's doing, we can put certain restrictions in place. That is what the rule allows us to do. Without risk of harm or likelihood of legal sanction, we can't. So if we think about risk of harm, the way that that is defined is a direct and serious risk of physical harm to self or others. Along with that, the person has to be causing the physical harm or very likely to begin causing the physical harm. So we can't say, well, we know when Heidi is upset and she walks around that chair 3 times, we know by the end of the 3rd time she's throwing it at her staff person. We know this because that's what she did before. Have to be causing or very likely to begin. We can't do things just because somebody did them once upon a time. Legal sanction, that definition means that there's a likelihood that this person will be evicted, arrested, or incarcerated because of what they're doing. And now, when this happens, I could have my rights restricted. So if when I get my paychecks, I give all of my money to my boyfriend, can't pay my rent, I've got an eviction notice, maybe family members bailed me out once, but they're not going to do it again. There's the potential that my team could restrict my rights and limit my access to my money because there's potential for eviction. Okay? So it has to be real potential. It can't kind of be made up, right? You know, if I've done some property destruction historically, broken lots of things in my house when I had a bad day, the local police department knows me to the degree where the officer who works weekends, when it commonly happened, comes over and says, hey, hi Heidi, you know, did you have a good day at work? Well, I'm glad because I'll be working this weekend. I don't want to come over and see you. That doesn't mean incarceration or arrested, right? Him saying that to me does not rise to that level. And it's hard because in some places around our state, you know there's law enforcement that will never arrest an individual with a disability. So you got to kind of know your person, know what they do, as well as know the system that you live within and what's going on. Risk of harm and legal sanction has to be documented. So it can't just be because we think, well, because it happened 15 years ago. It has to truly exist. It has to be documented that it's current. And when that happens, we cannot implement a restrictive measure, right, unless it's currently documented, and then you as guardian provide informed consent that you say, yes, I understand, I got it, I agree with everything, I understand the alternatives, and you sign the informed consent. Nobody can do it without your informed consent. And even after that, the county board or the ICF will have a human rights committee, and they too will have to approve it. Any restrictive measure, before it is implemented, it has to be approved by the human rights committee, whether it be the county board or the ICF. And if they don't approve it, right, if the team doesn't agree, they don't see that it's a current real assessed need, the guardian doesn't provide informed consent, and then the HRC doesn't approve it, it can't be implemented. All those things have to happen. So let's think about the restrictive measures. When we talk about restrictive measures, what are they? Manual restraint, mechanical restraint, timeout, chemical restraint, and rights restrictions. Now, if there's a risk of harm, right, if what I'm doing causes that physical risk of harm to myself or somebody else, any of these restrictive measures could be written into my plan, depending upon what was going on. If maybe I was having some issues and I was self-abusive and I was hitting myself on the head, a mechanical restraint that might be appropriate might be a helmet. If I'm scratching my face, a manual restraint that might be appropriate might be for somebody to hold my hands down. If I'm physically aggressive with others, I may have a manual restraint by 1 staff, 2 staff, 3, 4, 5, We've seen them all across the board. Chemical restraints, any medication that would be given for my behaviors to help me calm down, to help stop the behavior. And then rights restrictions. If there's risk of harm, there could be rights restrictions written into my plan. Now, if there's a likelihood of legal sanction, but not a risk of harm, right? Somebody could restrict my rights, but they couldn't do the top 4. So likelihood of legal sanction only allows for rights restrictions, right? So if there was the likelihood that I was going to be evicted, nobody could mechanically restrain me. Does that make sense? It's just rights restrictions could be implemented. When somebody has restrictive measures in their plan, they have to be temporary in nature. So you shouldn't see the same thing going on year after year after year. We have to be doing things to help change that person's life, to help them be more successful. We have to show that we're trying to give them their rights back. So temporary in nature is trying to ease the restriction away, that it's not something that's going to be there forever. If maybe I have a rights restriction in place because I've made some horrible decisions in relationships, maybe I've been a victim of human trafficking, right? So I can't be alone with members of the opposite sex, can't go out, right? Risk of harm, human trafficking probably meets that level. My team has to find some supports for me to help educate me, to help me make better decisions, to help me better understand, so that hopefully the restrictions can be eased up along the way. Restrictive measures also have to promote healing, recovery, and emotional well-being. They have to capitalize on the person's strengths to meet their challenges and needs. So we have to really think about what we're doing when we implement restrictive measures with folks. We can't just put things in place in a punitive kind of way, like, oh, you did this, well, you're not going to be allowed to have this, or, oh, if you do this, we're going to hold you down. We got to be working to change, think about the why I'm doing what I'm doing, and to change things, to make things better for myself and everybody around me. Teams have a whole lot of things to think about and and to ask themselves about when they're thinking about implementing a restrictive measure for somebody. You know, they have to think about the person's trauma. Like the example Beth used, there are so many examples when there are reasons people do things. You know, think about the medical conditions. I worked with a gentleman one time who, when he was having a bad day, everybody was having a bad day. And, you know, he would be very aggressive. He would, in the end, at some point in time, it would reach the point where chairs like this were going to hit the lights. There were light guards over all the lights because it was such a common occurrence. But that was going to be the end result at some point in time. But it would build up. It would escalate. You know, we always thought, why? Nobody really knew. And then one day, the facility that he lived at got a new physician who took an interest in him and realized that he had had an undiagnosed sinus infection for who knows how long, right? He couldn't communicate verbally. He never told anybody. We could tell there was something wrong, but nobody knew what, you know, and lots of people cared about this person. The sinus infection was treated. Those fluorescent lights quit bothering his eyes so much, so he really didn't have the need to throw the chair at them. I mean, so many things that we don't consider, that we just don't know. We just put restrictions in place, but we really have to think about these things. Thinking about, has this person been completely assessed, and what did that tell us? What if people tried before that didn't work? Trying the same thing for 10 years isn't going to get anybody anywhere. Derek is going to talk about what the behavior support rule is not.
So last year, I guess it would have been late 2014, beginning of 2015, I first read the behavior support rule. I'll be honest, I thought, well, this is ridiculous. And it really concerned me for a number of reasons. Because you have to look at, you know, as they've walked us through, there's this rule in place that says under what circumstances a guardian can request a restriction. So keep in mind, when we talk about a restriction, when we say we want a restriction or something of that nature, we're saying we want an amendment to the plan that says if the individual we're serving does this, the response is this, or this right might be taken away in order to prevent this behavior or something of that nature. And that was a very common occurrence. And the way that would always play out is typically, most often, a guardian would give consent for that restriction to be put into place, and then it would be put in place. And so it really frustrated me when this rule first came out, because you have to look at kind of the different systems that are in place here. We as guardians, we answer to the probate court, and the probate court has charged us with being responsible for making decisions on behalf of the individual. We make the decisions on their behalf, and we answer to the probate court. But we rely in large part upon the DD system to do its job. And so when it brings in providers, those providers are licensed by the state. And so it's the State Department of Developmental Disabilities that passes the rule saying a provider cannot implement or abide by a restriction unless it goes through the behavior support rule process that they've just walked us through. And so we've got us, the guardians, who are given authority and charged with making decisions by the probate courts, but yet we have the providers who are told you cannot implement a restriction just on the say-so of a guardian. It would have to be a guardian presents information, it goes to the team, then from the team it goes to the Human Rights Committee. Then if the Human Rights Committee says it's okay and it passes the test, then it can be implemented as an addendum to the plan. And so that left automatically this point of confrontation sometimes, at least initially, because we would have guardians on the one hand who would think, I'm the guardian, I'm here for a reason, I should be making that decision. And then we would have the HRC saying, no, that doesn't really fit these circumstances. That's not a good reason to restrict someone's rights. And so it naturally created a little bit of conflict. But I think what you have to remember is that this is not unique to the DD system. The same thing plays out with the elderly through the Department of Health regulations. And both systems are trying to comply with federal mandates from CMS and Department of Insurance and things of that nature. So on the one hand, I get frustrated because I see the behavior support rule as changing or altering the autonomy of a guardian making a decision on someone's behalf. but I also appreciate it because what can be the harm if a guardian has to basically show their case before restricting someone's rights? I mean, what does it hurt a guardian to have a reason before restricting someone's rights? And that gets to where sometimes it's become too easy for a guardian to restrict someone's rights, and it's caused problems in different circumstances. But we also have to remember what the behavior support rule is not. I mean, it does not convey the message that restrictions are not allowed. So I've had guardians that have called me and said, I'm not allowed to do restrictions that are absolutely necessary because of this new behavior support rule, and that's not what it says. What the behavior support rule says is you as the guardian, first of all, as we'll see on the next slide, no restriction can go into place without your consent. So unless you consent and you approve, no restriction can be amended or added to the plan. Once you consent and once you're on board that the restriction is necessary, then it goes through the rest of this process. And if you're the one that's advocating, if the need for the restriction is originating in you, the guardian, then you've got to show your case. You've got to be able to explain why it could result in some kind of unhealthy or unsafe situation or lead to a likelihood of legal sanction. It also does not override the criminal justice system. So Heidi, I think it was Heidi that said, you know, a lot of police officers won't arrest someone with a developmental disability. I have some clients who have met police officers who will arrest someone with a developmental disability, and they certainly are not immune from the criminal justice system. So those that are in the criminal justice system are absolutely subject to the sanctions and whatever requirements are imposed to the criminal justice system. So all bets are off. Once someone's in the criminal justice system, the behavior support rule has no effect. The behavior support rule does not stop any provider or staff from intervening in a crisis situation. I mean, if someone is climbing up on the ledge of a balcony because they want to walk a tight walk across the balcony 10 stories off the ground, provider staff are not supposed to sit there and say, well, that's self-determination. They have the right to try to do that. They have an obligation to intervene and would intervene in extreme circumstances like that. So the behavior support rule does not prevent someone from intervening in a crisis situation. With respect to, as I just said, got a little bit ahead of myself, but with respect to any of these restrictive measures, guardian consent is absolutely required. It's required to establish them, and then a guardian can withdraw consent at any time. If at any point in time a guardian withdraws consent, then that restrictive measure has to come off the table until the team gets together and reaches some new conclusion.
So we think back to restraint and timeout and the different kinds of restraints. This is really just a reminder to encourage you all to remind your teams that we really have to think about risk of harm and likelihood of legal sanction. Because without one or both of those existing, those things can't be done. Some common rights restrictions that we see in our system, and I'll say this, they have decreased. I don't have numbers, but we see them less and less often since the rule changed, because the old rule didn't address rights restrictions really. It talked about restraint and timeout, and the concerns that people have mostly now are not around restraint and timeout. They tend to be around rights restrictions. The things that we commonly see are diets that somebody is not in agreement with, doesn't want to follow, smoking restrictions all the time. We used to do a chart, and my favorite letter when thinking about rights restrictions was the letter C. So I would either use a chalkboard, use some paper, and put a big C, and let's think. What do we restrict on people that begins with the letter C? Whole lot of things, whole lot. We restrict Coke, we restrict cigarettes, other pop, we restrict coffee, left and right, we restrict caffeine, we restrict candy, we restrict community outings, we restrict all kinds of things for folks in our system. And, a lot of things that maybe we probably shouldn't. Required bedtimes, limitations on visitors. Okay, sometimes things are warranted, sometimes they're not, but these are just things that we commonly see. Limiting property. Remember we said earlier, somebody's having a bad day, first thing we do is take some things, when maybe that's the thing that gives them the most comfort. Probably not a great idea. Loss of activity due to behaviors, limits on where somebody can drink and eat things, You know, we had some individuals recently who, when some of my staff were out doing a review of the provider, they said, you know, their big problem was that the provider wouldn't let them eat in the living room. They get fast food, they won't let them eat in the living room. Well, some people don't eat in the living room, but the staff do, right? The individual's home. Individuals aren't allowed to eat in the living room, but the staff do. That's a problem, you know, that's a restriction of their rights. People not being allowed to control their own money. These are all common rights restrictions that we see. Not saying that they're always bad. Sometimes they're warranted, right? Risk of harm, likelihood of legal sanction. These things can be in place, but these are things that we do commonly see. So you have to think about the intent when you think about a restriction. Because sometimes something is not a restriction at all. A diet is not necessarily a restriction if it's a diet that you're in agreement with and you want to follow. If I go to the doctor and he says, hey, lose 50 pounds, start with a 1,500 calorie diet or a low carb something, and I say, well, okay, you know, maybe I'll join this group, that group, and it's probably a good idea. You know, I'd like to be healthier. Not a restriction. If I say, no thank you, and somebody forces me to anyway, that would be when it would become a restriction. So diet in and of itself is not always a restriction. So think about things like that. Same thing with some mechanical devices, you know. A helmet because somebody has seizures and falls, not a restriction. A helmet because somebody's banging their head on the wall, a restriction. So something specific in and of itself is not necessarily a restriction. It really depends upon the situation. Which leads me to this, which is something that I think Beth and I have said 100 times over, maybe 200 in the past couple years. There are no blanket answers. One little piece of information can change, right? One little piece of information can change the reason why, is there a likelihood of legal sanction? Is there a risk? Like the example that I used about human trafficking, bad relationships, right? There's a risk there, right? So my right could probably be restricted if that's what the team determined to do. Now, if it was just the fact that I have a disability and I'm 47 years old and my mom said, you know, my baby, I don't want her to be around any men, probably not risk of harm there. So that couldn't be implemented by my staff. All right, Derek's going to talk about access to information.
So since you've probably heard enough about rights at this point, we'll transition to access to information. And this it's impacted by rights though, and it certainly affects rights. As guardians, you need to understand what information you're entitled to. And so within the DD system, the answer is very simple. You are entitled to virtually all information. You're entitled to whatever county board records may exist as someone's guardian. You're entitled to any records being held or maintained by the provider. So if there are residential providers, day providers, whatever the case may be, day programming, you're entitled to view and review those records. If there's an MUI pertaining to the person you're serving, you are entitled to see that MUI investigation report. So MUIs, there's a specific statute that says MUIs are not public records, and they're not. But it also indicates that as guardian, you're entitled to receive and review that MUI report, and should be receiving and reviewing that MUI report, if for no other reason, to determine whether or not you need to create a report and forward it on to the court. Healthcare provider records. As guardian, you are entitled to access all healthcare records. HIPAA is not a barrier and should never be used as a barrier to a guardian obtaining healthcare information. Without fail, from time to time, I get information from someone telling me that they can't get access to information because a provider is telling them that HIPAA will not allow them to release the healthcare information. That just to me tells me that there needs to be some clarification, because when you look at the federal regulations pertaining to HIPAA, it references a personal representative, and there is a significant amount of case law indicating that guardian is a personal representative. And so a guardian would be entitled to access all healthcare information pertaining to the person you're serving. And as guardian, you should have that healthcare information. Dispute resolution. So within the DD system, we always have the potential for disputes. And so as guardians, we have to recognize those potential and understand when and how to resolve those disputes. First of all, anytime a dispute arises, the first thing we need to do as guardian is make sure we're keeping our focus where it needs to be, and that is on the individual we're serving. Unfortunately, a lot of times when I get retained or get involved in a dispute with a fight with a county board or whatnot, sometimes it ends up just being where we're just talking past each other and it's a communication breakdown. Where maybe it's the people who have lost sight of what's really best for the individual and they've dug their heels in on a specific situation or a specific issue. You've got to keep your focus on what's in the best interest of the individual. And sometimes that can mean being willing to admit that you're wrong, and sometimes that means you've got to dig your heels in and actually really advocate for the individual when people are telling you you're wrong. I truly believe, in my experience in working in this system, that the vast majority of guardians are absolutely doing a good job and are trying very hard to do a good job and are continuing to do a good job. But I think there's a small subset that sometimes go too far, and I think it's a pretty small subset. And when it comes to SSAs and county boards, I think the vast majority do very good work. They do very hard work, and they have a hard job, and I think they really do care about the people they're serving. But again, I think there's a small subset that go too far, and sometimes they're too pushy or make mistakes on their end. So you've got a spectrum. It's true of anything. I mean, you can put 100 of any profession in a room, and some of them are going to be bad at that profession. And so whether it's guardianship or SSA, you're going to have conflicts when you get into those extreme ends of the spectrum, and you have a guardian that's maybe going too far in what they want, or a county board that's pushing too far for what they want. You've got to keep your focus on the person you're serving, what's in their best interest, and always remember that reasonable minds can absolutely disagree. Advocacy does not have to involve alienation. We talked a lot about the team table and the fact that we come up with this plan at the team table. And if there's going to be restrictions put into place, sometimes it's usually a family identifies a restriction that they think would be appropriate, and a county board is saying, no, we don't want to do that restriction, and friction develops. And then people are saying, well, what happens? When there's this friction, who actually controls the situation? I mean, who has the final say on what happens? And the answer is, when you look at this team setting that we've developed in Ohio, there's really a codependency. So when we say the final say, I mean, that's always misleading. I get that question a lot. Who has the final say when the team table breaks down? And it's not a fair question, because as a guardian, we have to provide consent when it's appropriate, and only when it's appropriate. And we're not going to provide our informed consent if we're not comfortable that doing so is in the best interest of the person we serve. And they cannot proceed without our consent. So a county board, providers, whatnot, they cannot proceed without the consent of the guardian on that person's behalf. And so while I don't like using this term, that is, in reality, that is the leverage of a guardian. That's one of the things, is you're not going to give your consent until you're comfortable that the plan is truly in the best interest of the individual. Now, the flip side of that is you can't make the county board do its job differently, or you can't make them provide services that don't fit within the budget or that don't line up with what they perceive is necessary for the individual that's being served. So what we really have is a system of codependency. You are dependent, you are absolutely dependent on the county board to do their job and to do it well for the betterment of the individual you're serving. And they are absolutely dependent upon you to look at the totality of the circumstances and to provide consent when it's reasonable to do so. So to say who has the final say is a very misleading statement. You can't answer that. I mean, to say who has the final say ignores the fact that we all have different roles. And if we're not all fulfilling our roles, there's a breakdown that plays out to the detriment of the person being served. We also have to remember that we have a probate court that we answer to. Third parties have the right to file complaints about guardians to the probate court. One of the new provisions in Rule 66 is that any third party can file a complaint with the probate court. And if they think the guardian is not doing their job right, they can file that complaint. The probate court has to give notice to the guardian that that complaint has been filed, and then different probate courts will address it differently. Some courts will, again, send out an investigator. Some will set it for a hearing. I've seen different courts handle that different ways. Some courts, I've seen them send it to mediation. Understand that any of those third parties have the right to complain about you to the court. Also remember that as the guardian, you can always go back to the court. Now, different courts have different customs in terms of how detailed they will get in the day-to-day decision of guardians. You know, if you as a guardian believe you need to bring something to the court's attention in their capacity as a superior guardian, then by all means do so. Put down in writing what's transpiring, what your concern is, what you propose to do, and submit it with the court. Keeping in mind that's public record. Courts, you know, they may set it for a hearing and they may give you very specific direction on what they want you to do. They may look at the information and they may come back and say, you're the guardian, we appointed you to make these type of decisions, you know, make the decision. I've seen different courts handle that differently. But if you're concerned with what's going on, then by all means, you answer to the probate court and you have the right to bring one of these issues back to the probate court and seek court oversight or intervention on the matter at hand. Now understand though, you know, probate courts are not expecting you to come back to the probate court every time there's a fight at the team table about whether Johnny should have 3 cigarettes a day or 4 cigarettes a day. I mean, you know, those type of disputes, I think you're going to see the probate court, you know, get a little flustered and say, look, that's why we have a guardian in place, to work through these issues. And they're going to expect you to exhaust all of your possible ways of resolving conflict before you come back to the court. So what are your ways of resolving conflict? Well, the first thing you've got to understand is in the DD system, like any other administrative government body, we have a number of different things that trigger a right to appeal. Whether anything from determining eligibility to maybe we're saying, hey, that the current funding range isn't appropriate. We need more money under this IO waiver to pay for this or to pay for that. And the county board come back and says, no, you can't get funding for that. And we do something called a request for prior authorization to get more funding for this, that, or the other. And somebody says no. Anytime that happens, there's a right to appeal. And you're going to be told no in writing, and you're going to be given your appeal rights. Maybe it's that you're saying that, hey, I'm on the IO waiting list, and I should be given priority status on that IO waiting list because of this reason or that reason. And the county board says, no, that's not a priority. They have to tell you that in writing, and that triggers your right to appeal. And you can appeal that to a state hearing or an administrative appeal with the Department of Developmental Disabilities, depending on what you're appealing. Certain things like eligibility for services, those appeals go through the Department of Developmental Disabilities administrative system. Other appeals like requests for prior authorization and things where you're asking for more money that comes through Medicaid, those would trigger a right to a state hearing. In any event, once you're told no for one of those circumstances, they're going to tell you about your appeal rights and they're going to give you a time frame in which to appeal. You've got to pay attention to those time frames because those are hard and fast limitations on when you can appeal. And you need to submit your appeal in writing within that time frame if in fact you believe that a wrong decision has been made. So make sure you read what you receive. If somebody's making a decision that you don't like, read it carefully. And normally it's, it's on the bottom of the back page where they say, if you disagree with this decision, you have the right to appeal, and it'll give you a fax number or a place to mail your request for an appeal. What if it's not something to do with money and it's just a team dispute? Maybe you and the SSA just don't get along. First thing you've got to do, like I said before, is keep your focus on the individual being served. Talk about whatever the issue is with the SSA and try to reach consensus or agreement on whatever the dispute may be. If that doesn't work, request a special team meeting and bring in the entire team, the providers, if there's other healthcare professionals, maybe a psychologist, a counselor, whatever the case may be, bring them in and get their input. This is my concern, this is the SSA's concern. Try to talk through it and reach a definitive agreement on what's truly in the best interest, and never lose sight of communicating with the individual and incorporating what they want into that conversation. If that truly doesn't work, you can always talk to an SSA supervisor. But just like any other area of life, people get a little frustrated when you go to their boss. If you went to my boss, it would frustrate me. If you went to my boss without talking to me first, it would really frustrate me. So again, just like any other area of life, you can always go to an SSA supervisor, but understand that that's escalating the situation, and there's absolutely a time when guardians need to do that, but you need to be judicious about when you do that. And then as a last resort, you can always go to the county board and request a new SSA. Unfortunately, there are certainly times where just personalities conflict and you don't get along with the SSA, and you need to request a new SSA to be appointed. So that happens as well. What if it's a dispute with the provider? Basically the same thing. You're going to try to talk the issue through with the provider. You're going to go to the SSA, talk about the issue with the SSA. A lot of times SSAs can do a good job of being a buffer between when there's friction between a guardian and a provider, and can kind of be a go-between to help soften whatever friction that is and get to the bottom of what's in the best interest of the individual. You can always request a special team meeting. And then you should always remember that as a guardian, when it comes to choosing providers, in Ohio we have what's called free choice of provider. It's not just Ohio, but we have free choice of provider. So as the guardian, we exercise that free choice of provider on behalf of the person we're serving. If we want to fire a provider, we can. And if circumstances necessitate that, we should. But keep in mind that changing providers has a lot of residual effects on the individual. You need to have some plan as to what you're changing to. You need to certainly incorporate the wishes of the individual, and make sure you do all your due diligence before you make a change of providers, because that's a big deal in someone's life. Guardian liability. So this comes up a whole lot. Individuals are frequently asking questions about guardian liability, and I completely understand why. We have the behavior support rule that says, hey, guardians, you can't impose these restrictions unless it goes through the Human Rights Committee. And we have the Supreme Court saying, hey, guardians, make decisions that impose the least limitations on their rights, freedoms, and ability to control their own environment. And so we have all these different influences saying, to an extent, to paraphrase, back off and let the individual make as much of the decisions as they can for themselves. And that's a good thing. But that increases the risk in that person's life. And who carries that risk when something goes wrong? And that's where concern arises, because, if I say all the time, if something goes wrong and we're in a courtroom, typically it's not the team that's in the courtroom, it's the guardian and maybe a provider and then the potential ward. And so it creates this situation where we have uneasiness about, if I, the guardian, let the individual have self-determination and try to pursue letting them make as many decisions as they can for themselves, is that going to come back to bite me by causing liability for me if they do step out into the middle of traffic and cause a big accident? That's certainly understandable. So what do we know about liability? Well, first of all, let's address the easy side of liability. When it comes to contracts and debts, we don't have liability. As long as we're careful and we sign documents the right way, we have no liability. Where liability could potentially arise is in the form of negligence. We have a duty to the person we're serving as a guardian. Okay? And the duty is prescribed. We have duties that are prescribed by statute. We have duties that are prescribed in, our duties are prescribed by statute, and then there's further guidance given to us by Rule 66, the superintendent's rule. And so one of the concerns I have with respect to liability is the duties in the statute are still unchanged from 1990. That's the last time the statute was updated. And so the first duty in the statute is to protect and control the person. Well, it's hard to rationalize our duty under the statute to protect and control the person when we have these new rules saying we can't even limit the number of cigarettes they smoke in a day without going through a Human Rights Committee, or we shouldn't be restricting this, that, or the other without communicating with them and letting them control their own environment to the greatest extent they can. And so where this leaves us is in Ohio, like many other states, we're in a period of transition. We have these new rules. We have the new rules of superintendents. We have the new behavior support rule. What we don't have yet is a lot of cases, because normally that's what develops the extent of liability in these circumstances, is we have case law and precedents. And in Ohio, we don't have so much of that, which is a good thing because it means, in large part, guardians are not being sued. I feel very strongly that a guardian is going to have minimal, if any, liability in most circumstances as long as you're appropriately managing the information you have available to you. Where this has played out in other states, it has gone to the Supreme Court of other states, and they have said, no, there is no liability for a guardian because we give them all these rules saying let the person make decisions and self-determination and things of that nature. And in those cases, the courts have said there is not liability or responsibility on the part of the guardian because they're doing exactly what we've asked them to do. I think we will get to the same place in Ohio, but nobody wants to be the test case, or no one at least is volunteering to be the test case. So where does that leave us? Manage the responsibility you have. If the person you're the guardian for is crossing or is telling you, I'm going out to drive, and you know they can't drive, and you know that it's ridiculously unsafe for them to get behind the wheel, and you say, have fun, go at it, that's self-determination for you, and they go out and kill someone, I could see somebody coming back to you, the guardian, saying, what were you thinking? Why didn't you call the police or do this or that or the other? If the person you're the guardian for has a driver's license and they've been driving very successfully for a number of years, and they drive and they're in an accident, are you going to get sued just because you're letting them drive? No, I don't believe so. I don't believe you'll have any liability whatsoever in that scenario. So it comes down to managing the information you have available to you. I use the example, an extreme example in the 6-hour course. If I spend the day with my brother and he tells me that when he goes home at night he's going to burn the neighbor's house down, and I say, oh, Stephen, you shouldn't do that, but I can't really stop you. I'm just a guardian. Have at it. And then he goes and he burns the neighbor's house down, then somebody's going to come back and say, wait, you knew he was going to do that, and you knew he had a history of lighting fires and having concerns, he's done this in the past, and you did nothing to stop him. That's me doing a bad job of managing the information I have. If I'm the guardian for my brother and he has none of that history, and for the first time in his life, unbeknownst to me, he gets up in the middle of the night and lights a fire and burns the neighbor's house down, I don't see me having any liability. I certainly can't make any guarantees, but I feel very strongly about that when I look at our statutes and compare it to statutes in other states and look at case studies from other states. I feel very strongly that we would not have liability in that circumstance.